Well, we have today with us Tom Stockebrand, who has graciously agreed to do an oral history for the Computer History Museum. Thank you very much, Tom.
Hot dog. You're welcome.
I think where I would like to start is to understand a little bit about how you grew up, where you grew up, what the influences on you were when you grew up. So could you start with where you grew up, and we'll proceed from there?
Okay. Well, let's see. Evanston, Illinois, from the time I was born until I went away to college, 17 years later, I guess.
No, so what? Tell me a little bit about your parents.
Yeah,
what did your dad do? What did your mom do?
Okay. My dad was an osteopath, family doctor. He actually made house calls. In fact, he dragged us along, me and my brother, once in a while, to visit patients, and it was always Wednesday afternoon. But he also made house calls for emergencies and stuff. My mother actually, she a housekeeper. I mean, what do you call it?
Housewife.
Well, no, homemaker. Homemaker. That's what they're called. Anyway, however, she tells stories about when she was going to school in Northwestern, and that she was pinned to 7 guys at the same time. And that doesn't sound right, but she would say that. The bottom line is she was quite social. So my family consisted of my brother, mother and father, and then our mother's sister, my aunt, and then her mother and father. So my paternal grandfather and mother also lived in the house, same apartment. And my mother foisted off the business of raising the kid in the local sense, that is, doing the bath at night, and on my grandmother. And then she would run off, and I never realized until much, much later in college that I inherited from her a certain amount of socialness. And I didn't think of myself as social at all. I mean, I was, sit in the corner, don't bother with anybody, invent things. But there was more to it than that, which I just sort of didn't know. The other piece of it, I guess, growing up is my mother and her sister had bought a cabin up in Wisconsin in, 1933, it's before that, which we would go to every summer. We'd leave Memorial Day and come back Labor Day, So we go up there, open up the cabin, and then at the end of the time, we'd come back. And the problem with the cabin partly was that there was hunters up there in that part of, it's just north of Algoma, straight east of Green Bay. And the hunters would tend to break in the cabins that had been boarded up, of course. So my dad had a cadaver's arm, bones, complete with flesh or muscles, I guess. Of course, it was desiccated, but
yes.
And he would hang that inside, behind the shutter that was covering the door, but on the door.
Yes, on the outside, that way. Yeah.
Well, once the guy pulled the shutter back, that's what he saw. Never had a problem ever with hunters breaking in. So that's a good story. Anyway, as the years went on, my dad kept improving it. It started out outhouse, kerosene lamps, no heat. You get under the covers, thank you very much. But pretty soon it's buy a Onan generator or a 32 volt generator, and then another summer it's a Serval refrigerator, the kind that is run by fire. It's a there's a name for that. Absorption system, yes.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of the next step. Still no electricity, and then pretty soon, 32 volt Onan generator, and then pretty soon. The next step was power came to the little group of cabins that were in this forest, in this woods. And so now we didn't have to walk up the hill and pump the water and bring it back in a bucket, because the first thing to do with electricity is put a well pump in.
Yes, of course.
But they didn't string any pipes or anything.
Right.
That was later. And then, I don't know, a year or two later, they're stringing the pipes, and pretty soon we didn't have to have an outhouse. And then the next thing, Dad wanted to have a small boiler that would heat water, so now you even had hot water, and as a side effect, you could have some radiators from this. It's a little tiny boiler. And the bottom line of it all is I ended up with a kind of a stretched out course in home maintenance. and I think, I'm a mechanical engineer at heart, and it just sort of blended, and who knows whether it certainly gave me the education that I've used many times since in not having to hire the guy to do whatever the household job is, save hundreds of dollars. Nowadays, the guy drives his truck out, looks at you, and drives away. It's $90 just as a starter. So it was good in that respect.
So tell me about your early experiences in school. Where did you first go to school?
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, let's see. It was called Lincoln School. It was the local elementary school that went up to fifth grade, I guess. Mm-hmm. And the first teacher was Edna. What was her last name? I don't know. Anyway, kindergarten, and at that point it was half days, and so that was that. And I don't remember first grade, but second grade was Miss Bonslet, who was very helpful and so on. And I don't remember third grade, but fourth grade was Miss Rich, who she is one of those teachers that you remember for a life because she didn't put up with any bullshit. You will perform, you're able to, now do it. Yeah. Which is, everybody needs somewhere along the line, something like that, whether it's parents or teachers, or to kind of say, okay. And she did. And it was, so that was fourth. Fifth was Miss Goodrich, and the only thing I remember about that, she one of her segments was music. And I love to listen to music, and I get it, kind of. But one of her classes, she had everybody write a score. Just here's a clef, and here's some notes, and put them on it, and you can put. So I remember distinctly, she says, yeah, well, that's a lot of notes, she says. It was, I couldn't connect.
Yeah, you had no idea what
I was doing. But apparently some of the students could make it work. So let's see, that's fifth. These are just spots. Now in sixth, it was Miss Mylar, and the odd thing is when I went to, from fifth to, not quite sure what order, but anyway, I moved to middle school, and that would have been from fifth to sixth. And I'm pretty sure I'm saying it wrong, but it's okay. She moved too, at the same time to that middle school from where she. So. All right. So I was in her class for 3 years in a row, and I later. Long time later, I looked her up when she was 80 and I went back And she said, well, you were a sharp kid, and I made sure you got in my class.
She manipulated the system. Yeah,
well,
that's cool.
You know, she wouldn't have wanted to say that earlier, of course.
Of course not.
But it was quite a pleasure, because she was very supportive, not just of me, but she's a good teacher.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I remember going along in school is something that would never happen today. In about, I'm going to say, 6th grade or 7th, must have been 7th. I took the audiovisual equipment, put it on a cart, rolled it over to the next elementary school 5 or 6 blocks away, and presented the ERPI classroom films of the day to younger classes. In other words, it was the audiovisual setup. You'd never let anybody out on the street these days with a cart full of equipment, especially not a 7th grader.
Yeah.
But that was life in those days, quite different from life in these days.
Okay. Yeah, I was particularly interested in, so you were always liking to work on things or things like that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't, you didn't get that from a science class or something like that.
No. Which does trigger another one, which in middle school, they had a rule. You had to read 3 books a week. It couldn't have been that much. Must have been 3 books a month. But anyway, it was a requirement that one of those books be nonfiction. And so I said to the teacher, and I had never read any fiction.
Yeah.
So I said, am I not sort of screwing up the system a little bit? Because it's clearly missing the point. You should be telling me to read some fiction. She says, well, I guess you can get away with it. There's no rule about that.
Oh, wow.
So the result is I read, back issues of Popular Science. Popular Science used to publish a compendium of all the articles for the last year or 2 or 3 years in the book, and how to make fireworks, how to clean rust off things, how to build your own motor, on and on and on. So I just soaked all that stuff up, and that's where that's another piece of education that happened to be in the school system in its way. And then there was a shop class in which Mr. Michael, I guess his name was. Anyway, what you did is over the course of one semester, you built a sailboat by taking a block of wood that was, 2 feet by 6 inches, and carving it out with a chisel. So it was, and sure enough, I've got a cut right here that was the chisel hitting me instead of the wood. He was kind of a Lothario, and he was always in the aisle. But anyway, where I'm getting to is that I wanted to take auto mechanics for the extra piece.
Yes.
Let's see, I guess the sailboat must have been in, let's say, 6th, I don't know. And auto mechanics you could do in 7th or 8th. But by that time, I had made wait a minute, what's the order here? Well, just to jump to the point. I had taken 2 years of German as the side course. Oh, this must have, now I've got it. This is up in high school now.
Yeah.
A little bit later. And for freshmen, the language I chose was German because, if you're going to be an engineer or a scientist, you should be German at that point. And so I took a year of German and then the second year because first year you haven't got any language. And then the third year, I was going to take auto mechanics. And they talked me out of it. And they said, you really should take the third year of German. Well, in hindsight, that all worked out pretty well because in my sophomore summer, I went to Europe or junior summer. Rode around Europe on a bicycle, mostly in Germany. So, who knows which came first, where the bias was.
Yes, okay.
But there I was. And of course, I figured I could kill him with the German I knew. And so went into the bar when first it was in Dusseldorf. And I said, "Ich will ein dunkles Bier haben, bitte." Well, you don't say it that way. You say, "Möchte gern ein Bier haben." Möchte gern is the idiom. Anyway, I didn't know that. And of course, the guy caught on right away. He goes around in the back room, and he comes out with a beer in a stein. It's got a paper bag over it. So this is dark beer. And of course, the place went wild. Well, not wild, but
everybody
one of the
thought
better
this was
jokes,
a great joke.
But anyway, back to let's see. So now in high school, I switched a bit to electronics because I got interested in audio, and I built myself amplifiers, and people took 2A3 tubes, if you remember those, and then the 6A3s, and I ended up building a fairly powerful amplifier for the school auditorium system, and they used it. So the electronics snuck in there somehow. I don't know what this actual first little bit, but I ended up over my lifetime of being both electrical and mechanical.
Yeah.
And it sort of started here. We were installing that amplifier in the gymnasium, and I came back the next day, and somebody said, "Did you blow all the lights in the gymnasium?" No, I wasn't even there. So
No.
Talked to the electrician, the school electrician,
Yeah.
and he said, I didn't do it either. But I looked at his screwdriver, and it had a big smear on it. And in the bus bar, in the load center, there was a screwdriver-shaped little dent in the bus bar. And I thought, oh, okay.
All right.
But, hands-on.
Yeah. So how would you have learned how to do an amplifier? Would you
Well,
have
I
gotten that
remember
out?
reading books about it, but that's a good question. I don't quite remember what got me into electronics.
Okay.
Who knows? Maybe before the end of this it'll come to me, but right now I just...
Could have been one of these popular science
It
articles.
could very well have been.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. But something you had come across it
Yeah,
before,
well,
and it
yeah,
told you what you do or gave you a plan.
Something.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Circuit diagram. Maybe.
Yeah, the only thing I remember about planting seeds like that is my aunt, whenever I would get an interest in something, she would buy a year's subscription to whatever magazine supported that. Like, I remember Sky and Telescope, there was a child's version of that.
Okay.
And there was some other thing, and so I would like to tell you that she hooked onto something that was electronic, but I don't think so.
Okay. All right.
Anyway, I don't know.
Now, were there any science classes in high school that you think affected you, or
No,
you learned things, or I'm sure you took it, but
yeah,
but
me too,
they were just ordinary.
Yeah. Well, I was in it. I mean, let's face it, I was ahead of the curve always, so I wouldn't have remembered science classes much because I had a chemistry set, so I'd already blown up the.
Used all the good stuff up.
Yeah, right.
You'd already figured out all the.
Yeah, and my dad's hobby was photography, and this doesn't go there either. But anyway, his hobby was photography, and so he had a dark room. And over my life, I've built about 4 different dark rooms. And then color came along, and that was beyond me, and, as far as interest went. So that's a good question. I just don't know where.
All right, that's okay.
Yeah.
Don't have to.
Yeah.
So talk to me about when you're getting toward the point where you're going to go to college. What
Oh,
were your
yeah.
first?
Well,
Talk to me about your first thoughts about what you were
well,
going to do
that's
for
a good,
college.
Yeah, that's a good story. The teachers all said, "Well, you're a scientist," and it didn't quite fit in here. Although I didn't argue with them, because of course, in hindsight, it's clear I'm an engineer, not a scientist. And a little side story: when I try to explain to people the difference between a scientist and an engineer. Engineers design things like artists do, and if you gave 10 artists or 100 artists an assignment to do a landscape, out there, you'd get a whole lot of different pictures.
Right.
And some of them would be, anybody would know they were very good, and others would be sort of, yeah, well, maybe. And whereas, so an engineer is busy designing things and putting stuff together, kind of like the artist is putting together a picture out of palette of colors. The scientist is the guy that made the palette of colors. And I ran into a guy at MIT who was bragging because he had just completed an assignment, I guess you'd call it, in which he had computed the viscosity of air to the 7th decimal point, and it had only been published to the 6th decimal point, over the range of humidity and temperature and all of that. And so that's my story about science. So I didn't know really. Well, up on the wall it said Caltech has both engineering and science. I said, aha, I don't have to make a decision. And so I applied to Caltech, and then they said, well, of course, you got to apply to MIT, which I did. And my dad said, well, you got to apply to Northwestern Tech here in Evanston, which I did. And I got accepted all 3 places. And that didn't help a bit. Because I was hoping that, one of them will accept me and the other 2 won't. I don't know where I want to go. So.
Had you visited any of them before?
No. First time I visited Caltech was in the summer. Actually, it was before I attended, but that's another. Anyway, so now what? So I applied for scholarship to all 3 places. No, I didn't tell my dad till years and years later that I never had applied for a scholarship at Northwestern in my hometown, because that's the last place I wanted to be for my 4 years, was right at home, Anyway, I got accepted again. Got scholarships about. No, I really had to make it. So the decision, this is true. I said, well, if you go to Caltech, it'll be sunny California, and they'll walk around barefoot, and they'll, whereas if I go to fusty old MIT, they'll have to wear ties all day, and it's freezing in the winter and stuff. So I'm going to go to Caltech. Well, it turns out the reverse is true. At Caltech, they require you in the student houses to wear a coat and tie to dinner. And of course, sometimes we only wore a coat and a tie. That's the way it is. Yes. But nevertheless, I was wrong. But of course, the good thing is, I love to harass my MIT friends, and of course I got lots of them. I say, well, I ask them, how big is Caltech? And to remind them, I say, MIT is about 1,000 per class. Yeah. And so 4,000 undergraduates. It changes. And all
but that order of magnitude.
That's right. So they say, oh, well, Caltech, yeah, that's probably about the same size. Yeah? Well, my class was 130 people. And the entering class was 160, and some of them drifted off, But anyway, 130. The total undergraduate freshman.
Total undergraduate.
Total undergraduate, 640 people. Of course, it's a lot more now. It's like double. But and so I would rub it in on the MIT people. And then and if I was really upset at him, I'd say, now, and incidentally, my freshman lecturer was Linus Pauling, which it was.
Yeah.
He's a great showman. He loved to show. He had a slide rule 6 inches long, and of course he computed it ahead of time. But he would run out stoichiometric stuff, to the 6th decimal place on his little computer. And there's somebody in the back room. This was slide rule days, so none of this stuff.
Yeah, right.
But they'd go into their 7-place log tables,
Yes.
and compute it. It would be right, So anyway, so I would say to the MIT guys, how many Nobel laureates are in MIT at the moment? It was typically 1 or 2 that was teaching. And we would typically have 5 or 7, And so it was like,
Okay.
but that's evil, because MIT is a fine place.
Yes, of course.
And
You're just having fun.
oh yeah, well, if you don't find the evil gland in a person, you haven't learned yet about that person. Conversely, once you find their evil gland, you fall in love with them. And that is my history. I really use that. I mean, not directly, but I really believe that. And the other thing I really believe, and that's the end of my life philosophy, is childlike, not childish. And I really try to live by that. My wife, she gets all upset because she doesn't want her husband to be childlike. But sorry about that.
Or childish. Either.
Well, no,
Yeah.
of course not childish.
Yeah, right.
Nobody wants
Okay.
that.
Okay.
But the okay. Well, anyway, back where were we at?
We're
High
at
school.
well, I think the is there more things you'd like to say about high school, or shall we?
One
work
little
on Caltech?
vignette on high school is
Okay.
there was the German club had a quartet, or not, a little chorus group of 4 or 5 people, and Herr Mortal was the boss at the time. Oh, I think I just figured out where the electronics came from. The high school had a recording studio. And in that recording studio, they had a setup. And the piece of the story that links is that Herr Mortal said to me as we were going up to the recording studio, look, just don't sing. And it was a crushing blow at the time, although I can't sing worth a damn. And he was right. And I didn't. And the recording we made of whatever the heck it was fine. So, but now maybe that's the link, because I guess I got interested in the recording studio, and I remember now that's where I learned about, they call them XLM jacks, the standard jack.
XLR, yeah.
XLR jacks. I remember that from then, and that would have been 1949. They had them. I mean, the XL jacks haven't changed.
Yes,
At all.
exactly. All right.
So, okay, that might be, I guess I still don't really know, but that might be the, okay.
So now you're at Caltech. So talk to me about
Yeah.
what are you going to major in at Caltech?
Well, fortunately, I still didn't have to decide, because for the freshman year, it's a standard course, and your time is full, and there's no way you're going to change, which was good, because I still didn't have to decide. By the sophomore year, you had to at least decide between science and engineering, and the key was PChem, physical chemistry, and that was the tough one. And if you were going to be a scientist, you took PChem, and that turned me over. That's got me over into engineering, and I was a mechanical engineer from then on. And backing up just a little, which does link, oddly enough, with all this whole thing. It's funny about that. My graduation present from high school was, the parents said, take our Plymouth, two buddies. We put a trailer, homemade trailer on the back of it, just a box on the front axle of some car. And we toured the country from Chicago out to the West Coast and then north and back. So I got to Caltech in that summer. Just as long as we're doing it, let's go look. It was all signed up by this time. Went into the, spent a day there. Not quite sure what the other guys did, but anyway, ended up in the buildings and grounds shop, and they were talking about fish glue and all this stuff, and we were doing great, So when I got back there, I was the guy that knew my way around the backwoods of the campus.
Yes.
And the punchline of this particular little story is that Dr. Karopoulos, who was his forte was designing automobile engines and combustion and milliseconds and octane and all that stuff. And it turns out, if you want to check it out, you have to have an engine working, and it has to actually burn it up, because otherwise you're going to be have exploding gases around. So you have to really run the engine. So we get into mechanical, whatever the first ME 101, whatever it was. And he says, well, now the next courses are, the next meetings of this course are in the mechanical engineering shop. And the students in general said, where's that? He said, if you don't know, you're not a mechanical engineer yet. And of course I knew, so, because I'd been there. And it was, it was very helpful, because I was in it. And when we built a volcano for decoration at one of their inner-house dances, I took two 55-gallon drums and welded them together so it was a tall column, right? Fill it full of water up to about, 10 inches from the top. Propane, bubble it over the top, and the propane bubbles up, and a little spark gap. And as soon as you get enough, because it's heavier than air, so it's coming up, as soon as it gets up to the spark gap, whoo! So then we surrounded it with paper mache, which we didn't get too close to the, you have to get over the top to see. But anyway, now here comes the interesting, this just occurred to me. How do you make the sound of a volcano? Boom, rumble, bum, bum, bum. Well, again, to compress the story, you take an audio amplifier and you let it drive a solenoid. You let the solenoid pull a tennis ball on a string out. And when it lets go, the tennis ball goes back and hits the screen, which we stole from the window screen, and you have a microphone on the frame of the screen. And lo and behold, it does. It sounds just, think about it. See, the tennis ball goes boom. It really worked out very well.
That is really funny.
Anyway, but then, of course, the usual stuff, catapults of oranges over into the other student house. Oh, one of the things that was, two more, but first one, stock and trade is take a EMT to a conduit, electric conduit, roll up paper and make it in a kind of a wedge, like an ice cream cone, only backward. And now you've got a blowgun, and that you can use that blowgun to blow through a telephone book. You'd never believe it. Really? Never believe it. Oh, and we're going to get back to to that when we get around to the hypersonic wind tunnel here in 20 minutes or 10 minutes from now. But anyway, I was on a point, and of course it has now slipped away.
Well, you've
Inter-house dances.
and volcanoes.
And
Blowguns.
blowguns, but it was. Oh, yeah, I remember now. Another decoration. This was a year or two later. There was lots of ultraviolet light around and in different decorations and water flowing, and it turns out you can put a chemical called trimethylethyl umbelliferone,
Yes.
which is what makes white clothes whiter than white in Rinso washing powder.
Okay.
That's how they do it. They make it fluoresce. They don't tell anybody. They just say ours is whiter than anybody else's. So that's how you found out about the chemical. And so we put some of that in some water and shone a lot of ultraviolet light around. Well, it turns out that nylon doesn't soak up, it's a smooth fiber. It doesn't soak up anything. But cotton, which is very intricate, soaks up whiter than white without hard. And the girls were all wearing bras in cotton and blouses in nylon. So we had an owl up high, which had eyeballs that would see motion, or, it was very crude. It was nothing like what you'd get today. Anyway, this owl would follow all the girls around with their big boobs. And it was a hit.
Of course it was.
But it was all kind of accidental. I mean, just how were we to know?
Oh my goodness.
Anyway, we probably learned more about physics and
Chemistry.
and stuff.
Doing things like this
Yeah,
than
or at
in
least
class.
maybe not learned, but got aware of.
Yeah.
Peter Christie told me one day, "You're a successful failure, Tom." Why? He says, "Well, you know a hell of a lot about a hell of a lot of engineering stuff, but you don't know anything in any detail about anything. So you are going to fail." And he's right. So I got to thinking about that. Well, what would you do? Well, I told this to some other guy. He says, "Oh, that's no problem. You want to be a patent attorney. They have to know all about certain individual things and get a little deep in it and know what they're doing." And by this time, I'd already reviewed a few patents myself, and about a third of them are fraud. They just dreamed up a bunch of claims that don't. Some of them bear no resemblance. And I read a couple that are, they're perpetual motion patents.
Yeah.
Now, how does that get through?
Right.
But
to refute Peter's claim, did you ever find a problem you couldn't solve?
Well, if I pick the problems that I can solve, the answer has to be no.
That's very good.
Or eventually make it work somehow?
Yeah, I guess not. I mean, for the purpose of your question.
Yeah.
But of course, I had lots of failures. Everyone has.
Right.
It's not.
Didn't quite make the intended thing happen, right?
Or it took too much trouble to give up on it, or something. I don't know.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So
Where are we at?
well, we're at Caltech, and we've been discussing projects, extracurricular projects.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, of course, the education itself was fine. A lot of cramming. As the notes say in there, I can't stay up after 10:30. It's just my nature. I can't stay up to these all-night parties people had. I've done it once or twice, sure, but so I couldn't cram because before, and just so I would always go into the exams and have to derive the formulas. But turns out that's good practice.
Yes.
And if you get in the habit of knowing what the really basic, Ohm's law or really basic stuff, and if you can then use that to
You can figure out
stuff. Now, of course, you get a B instead of an A because you didn't always get through the exam. But I learned more in the final exams than I learned in the courses. Well, of course, this, obviously it was integrating it.
Yeah.
It wasn't literally true.
Yeah.
But let's see, Caltech and courses.
Now,
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Did you have a good memory? Was
Certainly not for names and faces.
okay?
No.
Yeah.
But all Caltech's. You just hit on something I never thought of. All Caltech's exams are open book. So you don't need a good memory. You just need to know where to turn the page. Now, not quite all, but essentially, all the heavy-duty ones were open. In fact, you could take the exam out of the room, go out in the lawn and do the exam out there if you wanted, And they had a really strict code of honor code. And they really did. They actually kicked people out of school, about one a year, who they discovered was cheating.
Okay.
And that they were pretty tough about that. There was just no argument. I got off a little bit.
All right. Well, let's just keep going.
Sure.
Were there any specialties in mechanical engineering that?
No. It was a rigid course again. The whole curriculum
Was all planned out. Okay.
Yeah, but I did want to take some more courses in electronics because by now it had hit. And the only way you could do that was cut classes in the prescribed curriculum and go. So I was thinking maybe I could do a dual degree, but you just can't. You can if you take another year, of course. So I ended up saying to people, and the truth was, sort of halfway from mechanical to electrical. And over my later career, it was always input-output equipment, which, if you think about it, is sort of mechanical. Whether it's disk drives, which I didn't go too much, but
it's always it has a piece of both.
Yeah,
They all do. Yes,
yeah,
of course.
But specifically the stuff I worked on, I started out. Well, maybe we're up at deck now. I don't know.
Well, let's
Army is.
let's keep going on the chronology. I think that's a
Sure.
good way to do it.
Sure.
So you graduate. So
Yeah.
what are you thinking of you're going to go
Well,
do? Talk to me about
that's
where are
good.
you going to get your first job?
That's good. Well, first of all, the sophomore summer I learned how to fly, which affected me a lot over time. I stayed at school, and you can learn to fly in 30 days in Southern California, where anywhere else you have to beat the weather and all that takes a year. So that's just a statement.
Okay. Now,
And
why did you learn to fly? I need to understand what pushed
I
you
guess
to do that.
I don't know.
Some friends knew
No,
how to fly?
I was completely alone. But not literally alone. But, you know.
I understand. Just decided to.
There must have been some seed that got the
But you don't
flying
remember.
bug. Must have been. Oh yes, somebody. Yes, there was. Some other people who flew light planes took me for a ride preceding years. I remember one guy. He purposely did a spin, and I said, "Oh God, not this one," because I get sick pretty easy. Of course, later you discover, like boating, the person at the helm doesn't get sick because they're somehow psychologically in control, you know. And I managed to produce the same effect in a kid later on, in which I had my legs crossed while I was sort of being check pilot, and he started, I don't know, turn left or something, and I jammed on the correct rudder pedal, but my legs were crossed. Bingo! We were in a spin. So I had to, anyway, backing up. So that summer was learn to fly. The next summer, I forget. Yeah, no, it was my junior summer that I rode a bicycle all around Europe.
Okay.
And that's when all the Europe stories come up,
Okay.
and learned how to drink, learned to like strong beer, and
Yeah.
and a lot of stuff like that. Okay, now we're back to, what was the segue?
Yeah, where
Where I go to work, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's another good story. I did the usual thing where they all come to the campus and you have interview after interview with people, and you sort of, one of them was with Food Machinery Corporation, and the job was to work what was I now know is in Plano, Texas, where they make the fuses and stuff for the bombs or the nuclear whatever.
Yeah.
And the interviewer starts questioning me. He says, "Well, do you ever make a mistake?" I said, "Sure, of course I make a mistake. Everybody makes a mistake." And then I forget the precise next question, but pretty soon he says, "Well, if you wanted to build a bridge as a mechanical engineer, of course, that you have to have everything precisely right or the bridge will fall down." I said, "No. It's way over designed and there's lots of extra parts." And then he says, are you accident prone? I said, "Yeah, I guess so." Interview ended right there. Because, of course, I didn't realize, and he wasn't telling, what the job was to somehow get involved. And, of course, the interviewer had to hang up too, obviously. But it was kind of a cute story. Anyway, I didn't get that job.
No. So what was the job?
Well,
You found out later?
Well, it was to make, to design fuses and details, input-output equipment for bombs.
Okay, fuses for bombs. Okay, got it.
One-time use.
Yeah, right. Which, by the way, I did that later. That's another story.
All right.
But
All right, so that interview,
that
that was
interview.
just an
Okay,
example.
then the next one was where I thought I really would go, and I'm glad I didn't, was Ingersoll Rand. Because here's a mechanical engineer, newly minted, and they're into compressors and thermodynamics and, the whole thing. Now, what switched it to something? That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Something switched it to Sperry gyroscope, which was, of course, one of the terrific accidents of.
Yeah, right.
Everybody's life has
great accidents. Yes.
Has twists in them. Maybe I'll remember, maybe I won't. But I ended up accepting. Oh, at this same period, that is starting senior, IBM paid for me to go to Poughkeepsie, New York, for a job interview. Well, when I got there was 300 other people
That they paid for.
they paid for, so it wasn't quite as spiffy a thing as I thought. And I was going to check out. I had all the prejudices, which is they're all uptight and the salesmen sing songs and all that. And so I'm interviewing, and I talk to the engineer interviewee, and I say, is this true? He says, "Oh, of course not. This is a relaxed place." So we get up to go to lunch, and he gets about 10 steps down the hall, turns back around, goes and gets his coat and puts it on, his suit jacket. Oh. So that was, and at the end of that interview session, you go a bunch of people all day. You ended up in my case, you ended up at the, what they call HR now, personnel. And I go back and I sit with my little book, and there's nobody around. They'd all gone home. I was behind the curve somehow in the timing. And now here I am, 2 miles out of the center of the town of Poughkeepsie, no choice but to walk over there. So I'm walking, and IBM employee was going home from some other, and he drives by, and I said, you know, he said, can I help you? I said, yeah. And he was mortified, you know, that IBM should leave me sitting there. But it just reinforced my internal prejudices all the more.
Yeah,
so, you know.
exactly.
However, when I was trying to decide whether somehow that got me to Sperry Gyroscope, but it didn't.
Okay.
Anyway, somehow or another, I ended up getting a job offer from Sperry, and I went to work for him as a field service engineer trainee in New Hyde Park, Long Island, for the summer, in a job which they said was draft proof. And during that summer, however, one of the professors at school called me up and said, would you be my, what do they call him in the stagecoach days, the sidekick, the rider, or the guy with the gun, whatever, would and drive the bus as an alternate. And he and his mother were tied together with, you know, they call it, Oedipus has a silver cord. Well, this one was a tungsten carbide cord, you know. I mean, it was, so she was sitting in the back of it was crazy. Anyway, so we visited a number of, this is in the summer. I only worked for him for a week or two before I took him off. I said, can I take the 6 weeks off or 5 or whatever? They said, oh yeah, okay, you know. Anyway, and we visited mechanical engineering, mostly vice presidents of big deal companies like Ford, and as I told you a little earlier, Harding. And Harding was kind of interesting. They make lathes and stuff which have 300 horsepower pulling a chip that's this dimensions spiraling out. I mean, really, they needed all 300 horsepower. That poor cutting tool, my God.
Exactly.
So anyway, and one of them was Ford Motor Company, and it was the vice president in charge of some aspect of engineering. He had cigarette nicotine all the way up his fingers, chain smoked, and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, one of the things, we were passing through Princeton, and we stopped, and my friend knocked on Einstein's door, and his lady answered, his housekeeper, and I don't know what he said to him exactly, a friend of a friend. I don't think he knew him.
Yeah.
Anyway, Einstein really did come out, and they talked for, 5 minutes, and shook his hand. And when I tell that story, some people, not very many, but a few,
Get very excited.
get over the moon about that, you know.
Okay.
It's stupid, but
Anyway.
once in a while. Okay, so I go back to Sperry after this trip, which is
In the middle.
in the middle of the summer, and I get drafted. Why? Because a year ago when I took the trip around Europe, I lost my 2A or 2C or whatever deferment for the summer. So I had to go to my draft board and ask, Purdy, please, would you let me go on this trip, even though I'm not, strictly speaking, covered while I'm not physically in school. And they said, okay. And by the way, that delayed me, and I ended up getting on an airplane and meeting the friend I was going to go with. I was there first because I got on the airplane. He was still on the boat. And that's another whole story.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Anyway, so they drafted me because, of course, in hindsight, you can see, oh, we'll let him go, but
Yes.
but I didn't see that at the time, of course, but this made good sense. But the Army was fun, and, you know, as I say, basic is a short course in camping. And they assigned me correctly. Since I was a field engineer trainee, I ended up on a mobile maintenance team for a few years out in Silver Spring, taking care of ACAC sites. And
Silver Springs, Maryland?
yeah,
Yeah.
and the team had 4 or 5 members. The guy who took care of the power diesel generators, he came from Wyoming Power and Light. And the guy who took care of the radar itself had just come out of 42 weeks of radar school. And I was taking care of more of the way analog computers ran. For gun control, it's a great big cam in there that looks like a piece of taffy. And it slides and it rotates for elevation angles, and then it reads off this 3-dimensional cam, what you set the gun at to get to that particular, make the thing hit. So I had training in that with Sperry, and here I am at a field maintenance team. Now it turns out all we really did was fix shift registers. And the first shift register, the first time I ever touched anything you even remotely call a computer, was I had to fix it. And later it would have taken 5 minutes. It took 2 weeks to figure out what's going on. But there was the ceiling education for what ended up digital and the MIT radio railroad club and switching and all that.
And this is 1953 or 54.
Yes, that's right. So anyway, that's the Army, and I got out of the Army, and all the people who had done their best to dodge the draft said how awful my 2 years must have been, and they were sympathetic for me. I said, bullshit, it was terrific.
Yeah, it wasn't a problem at all.
And the punchline on the mobile maintenance team is the commander, Captain Frank, taught me everything there is to know about management in one sentence. He said, I, the boss, work for you to do what you could do yourself, but I can do it a lot better because I got a lot more rank. And that says an awful lot if you think about it. How many managers will tell you they work for their people?
Yes.
See, it's relatively rare.
Exactly. They don't think that way. You're right.
Yeah. Now, of course, Dick is more full of that kind of people than a lot of other places, but still,
Yeah.
Okay, now we're back to.
Now you're out of the Army.
Now I'm out of the Army, so I go to MIT and say I want to get a master's degree, because my dad said, "Look, you've got to get a master's degree. You're sharp enough." And so I went there. Well, it turns out right then there was a huge glut of GI people.
The GI Bill, yes.
The GI Bill. And later I found out, they said, look, we were rejecting everybody. I said, well, I did pretty well at Caltech. I was in the top half by one person. And they said, well, that wouldn't have mattered really. Why don't you go to work for Lincoln Lab and do whatever and take courses at MIT, which I did. But Lincoln Lab was so much more fun. I'm just not a scholar, it's just the way it is. So we started out with paper tape, and my first job was to make the paper tape reader work.
Yeah, so who hired you at Lincoln Lab?
Wes Clark.
Wes Clark, okay,
and
was your
he
boss.
was my mentor off and on for the next few years. He's the guy that came to me and said, we have this machine called TX2, and we want to have you make a tape drive, because that's all it was at that point. There was drums, but they're limited capacity. We want to make you a tape drive that makes it so TX2 does not have an input-output structure, only input. It has to have so much volume, and we ended up with 8 drives with a mile of tape on each one of them, and 3-phase motors, and magnetic amplifiers, and it was great fun. And we cooked up, and Dick Best said you have to have Manchester recording. I'm not quite sure who said you have to have block track recording, but that was the key, to simultaneously read just like a disc. You read a track and use that as the timing for the rest of it. Salesman later said, if you'd just told us this was a long, skinny disc, we could have sold it much better. And there was truth to that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Wes said, so much storage. And so that was after a couple of preliminary things, paper tape, and then.
Because you had no experience.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. So he needs to have you do something so he can, get a read on what he thinks you're capable of doing.
Well, no, I think he thought I'd do it just fine. I don't think it was an experiment.
Yeah. Okay.
He came to me and said, "Do that."
Yeah. Well, the paper tape, though. Talk
Oh,
to
the
me
paper tape.
about that project.
Well, yeah, the paper tape was. I eventually got it good enough. It would read waxed paper, and that's pretty good, because the wax part diffuses, and then the hole is direct. So if you work the optic, well, there weren't any real optics, but anyway, if you get the photocells down under there, right. So yeah, that's right. And also, that's when the IBM story showed up. Now let's see. No, that's long. That's a lot later. Forget it.
Yeah. Okay.
So
they were having trouble with their paper tape reader. Had they built it themselves, or
no,
was this
they
a
bought
Ferranti?
it from some. They bought it.
Ferranti
It was
reader?
a Ferranti.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and we fixed it up. Anyway, I got ahead of my story.
Okay.
Because. No, I didn't. That wasn't the first job. Yeah. No, I'm okay.
There was a group working on the tape drive. How'd that project come together?
It was just me.
Just you?
Well, I had a technician and stuff, but.
But yeah, so okay. So Wes Clark just said
Wes did it all, in the sense of setting up the goal, and he taught me about shift register controls, where you shift bits in as the tape slides along, and certain sections don't repeat except where there should repeat, even though you're halfway between. Okay, that's what a shift register code is all about. So I think he contributed that piece, and he contributed the basic idea, and Dick Best contributed Manchester recording, and I'm not sure, I might have thought it up myself, but I give credit to Dick Best for this, which is make it so the tracks, every logical track is two physical tracks just wired together, but separated on the tape, so that if there's a spot on the tape or a piece of dirt or something, it might affect one track of the pair, but not the other track. See, so now it's redundant right at the bottom, and sure enough, 10, 12 years later,
Link tape and duct tape came?
Yeah, but just to close this one, Les Ernest, you know him? Yeah. He's out there, out your way. Anyway, he was a Stanford AI lab guy, ran it and all that. Anyway, he was working at Lincoln Lab at the time. He went back 10 years later, the drives were still there, and they still read off perfectly.
Right.
Wow.
Was this wide tape and
Yes.
many tracks? How many
Yes.
tracks?
Well, it was 10-track head.
Okay.
And let's see. Yeah. One pair was the timing track as the outside ones, which, by the way, made it so that skew didn't matter as much because it was the sum of the two.
Yep.
And then the next one in was the mark track with the shift register code on it to block it all out. And then the inside 6 tracks were 3, a pair and a pair and a pair, with as far apart as you could get them. So it was only 3 tracks of actual data. But when you have a mile of tape, on a 14-inch reel, there's quite a bit of storage. And then
Yeah.
Of course, by
You remember
today's
what?
standards, it's nothing.
But you remember what the recording density was? The linear recording
It's
density.
about 300 or 400 bits per inch.
Okay.
Wasn't very much.
Yeah, but that's
But the thing about it, as you went faster and faster, two effects, interestingly enough, canceled each other out. One is that the tape floats higher from the shoe, the head, but it's going faster. So the fact that it's a little further away, the amplitude of the signal stayed roughly the same from about 100 or so inches per second to 1,000 inches per second.
wow.
So the thing worked just slick over the whole range of dynamical range. And that was serendipity. I mean, that just turned out that way, you know.
And this was reel-to-reel.
Reel-to-
loading, so you didn't have pinch rollers.
No.
Something IBM was fooling with.
Right. It looked just like, well, deck tape. Well,
Same idea.
so the next thing, I don't know where we're at in the dialogue, but the next thing that happened is Wes came around after, this is maybe a year or two later, and he said, I'm cooking up this little computer for researchers called, they called it Link.
Yeah, that's right.
Lincoln something computer. And we need a little bitty storage for it. You know, what at that time would have been cassettes. People already knew they were obsolete, but discs, floppy disks hadn't quite got there yet.
Yeah, right.
So he said, just take, it's easy, Tom, just take your big one and make me a little one I can stick in my shirt pocket. So you see, Wes was behind the whole thing.
Yeah, the whole,
I
all
don't
of the fundamental thing.
Yeah, I don't get any credit for the fundamental stuff, but I'm a great tinkerer, so.
Right. So let me ask just one
Yeah.
more question
Oh, yeah.
about the big tape. So fundamentally, this is reel to reel. So is there a range of velocities over the head that it works at, and how is that controlled so it doesn't?
Well, that's good. You turn on the front motor, and you put a little drag torque on the rear motor, and wait, and pretty soon you got a signal. And it turns out to be whatever, pick your number, maybe 50 inches a second or something.
Yeah.
And you know that because you got a mark track on a timing track, and
You can tell how fast it's
comes
going.
up.
Yeah.
Well, you always want it to go faster than you wanted at any given time. We never measured the speed. I mean, well, of course on the scope and stuff, but for the purpose of control, we just went full bore. The leading reel, when it got full at 1,800 RPM, the trailing reel was going 5,000 RPM, sounded like a buzzsaw.
Oh my goodness.
Because the diameter down here and the diameter up here, so 3-to-1 or whatever. I mean, it was something else.
So why such big tapes and so many for TX2? What were they trying to do?
Well, they were trying to. He was correct. He wanted to have only input, no need for output. So much internal storage that you never needed to do anything but add. And if you really had infinity internal storage, there wouldn't be any input output. It would all be in. But so it was.
But the application, I mean, were they doing radar signal processing or?
Speech processing. The money came from the government for the SAGE aircraft system.
Okay.
Lots of researchers came and went. And at one point, I remember when, well, it's getting mixed up. Just before this episode with the tapes, which became the future, I was in charge of the memory test computer, which Ken Olsen had invented the core memory, and this was a big old machine that incorporated it so they could put various different detailed designs of core memory in and try it out and make sure it worked. And all it was a whole bunch of delay lines and a lot of patch cords. And so they sent me, they wanted tape drives because that's what you had for big storage.
Yeah.
So they sent me to IBM Poughkeepsie, back to where I had been years before,
Yes, of course.
but on the production line, because IBM didn't have any literature or support literature for the customers. And they were going to donate us these tape drives. I don't know if it really donated, but they ended up in the Sage system. So somebody had to take care of them, so they stuck them on MTC, and I got the job of taking care of them. So they sent me out for 2 months to IBM production line, and that's really good education, because on the production line there are problems which cannot possibly occur later because it already did work once.
Yes.
But on the production line you can have wires crossed and all kinds of stuff. So in the end I wrote them their manual for how to do the checkout.
Yeah.
And that hooks to the big story, which is I took my tux along because I was going to date the girls at Vassar, which I ended up doing. The social chairman of Vassar, it was only a few weeks before I was going to leave, and I finally got her to go out. She said, "Oh, you're a good dancer." I said, "Well, you would have found that out a month or 2 ago if you just said yes." Anyway, so I had a tux, right?
Yeah.
I was living with side story. I was living with an old Jewish guy, absolutely Orthodox. I turned his fire on after sunset, and I read him the Bible, and I got to like Ruth and Esther, and so, there's a lot of good stuff in the Old Testament. They were really terrific stories. Anyway, back to the point. So I said, well, here I am at IBM, and some days I wore clothes, sort of navy fatigues, blue jeans and a denim shirt. And other days I said, well, I'm going to check out this business of what you have to wear at IBM, and I would come in not a suit, but all dressed up. Tie, didn't go anywhere near a lathe. I was smart enough
with the
not to
tie.
do that.
Yes, okay.
And then I would sneak down and watch. Sure enough, the salesman did sing songs at their downstairs where they were meeting. And so one of the guys on the production line says, "Why do you sometimes wear good clothing and sometimes sort of ordinary?" I said, "Well, I made it up. Some days I feel good, and I feel so good that I get dolled up. And some days I even feel good enough to wear a tux." That just slipped out. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway, his eyes got big as saucers, He believed every word of it. So I said, "Oh shit, I'm stuck." And sure enough, I wore a tux to IBM production line on the floor. And I came in through the memory stringing department, and I got all kinds of, it was great. The hoops and hollers, and the girls were all, it was great. They all took it perfectly straightforward. Got on the production line, and of course the first hour or two, same thing. People were kind of adjusting, but pretty soon you're just doing your job.
You're just doing your stuff, yeah.
Oscilloscopes and probes and stuff. Well, here's the punchline. 3 p.m, comes this entourage down the aisle, and it's the section chief and the chief of his boss and 2 more and some HR people, and the head of IBM's production line at IBM Poughkeepsie, New York, and they offer me a job. Right there, standing on the floor. And he says, "We can probably do better than Lincoln Lab is paying you." And I said, "Well, I'm sure that's true, but I've only worked for Lincoln now for 3 or 4 months, and I'm here." Oh, okay. They never once mentioned the tux. Nobody. So you imagine, did the job, see, by this time they knew me because I'd written the stuff for them and all that, so that's legit. But you know, did he get a memo saying, you got to see this? or was he going to come that day anyway? Or he would have called. Never knew. He would have called. In truth, he would have. If it had been normal, he would have called me in his office if he was going to offer me a job. You know.
Right.
So you just have to think. You can dream up all kinds of stories. And I did run across the section chief some years later in LaGuardia, we were passing through. And he didn't really know either. He just said he got recruited. So then when I went back to Lincoln, of course, I put the tux on. And I was going to say, well, see, I got culture at IBM. They just totally ignored me. Of course, they really didn't ignore me. It was just the put down. Or you think we're going to fall for your stupid story. You know, or your game. Of course, they didn't know the background, but anyway, never mind. So that's the full-blooded IBM story.
That is very cool.
Yeah, that's good. So back to Lincoln Lab, Dick Best is working on the tape project.
No, he was the chief engineer, okay. So he was advising lots of people on different things, and when I needed help, I went to him. Now, okay, so then Wes says, I want link what would later be a floppy disk, you know, or something.
Yeah.
And so we just copied the big drive down to a little one.
And the spec for how big was fit in your shirt pocket. Yes.
Fit in your shirt pocket. And the other spec that stands out, he says, there shall be no more errors than one in the lifetime of any programmer that ever uses this system. Well, see, by that time, the redundancy business had been proven to work very well. And then I did not make what would have been a mistake and get the, see, density of 375 bits per inch isn't much. Even then it wasn't. You could get up to 1,000 or 2,000. I said, no, we're not going to do that because that's going to be reliability issues. So if reliability is critical, you don't try and pack more on. Anyway, however, a fellow named Charlie Molnar actually designed the mechanical design. He did it all wrong, in my opinion, my professional. And I tried to talk to him, but he did it all right. But for instance, the drag torque matters. A little tiny side story. While we were checking out later the deck tape, we moved the track back and forth 1 million, actually 30 million, huge number of times, back and forth for a few feet. Turn around, go the other way, a few feet. It never even lost the roughness of the surface. The surface never even developed a shine because the tape never hits the head. Air is so viscous. If you divide out the weight, kinematic viscosity, it's more viscous than SAE 30 oil. So it immediately rolls itself in and gets itself between the tape and the head. And the head never, ever hits the tape. Wow. Nor do the shoes in this design. Because, of course, the radius is a lot bigger. The head radius is whatever, a millimeter or two. And the shoe radius is 10 millimeter.
The shoes are tape guides.
Yeah, tape guides.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So after running forever, the two ends where it turned around are completely free of magnetic flux. You know what? You know, virgin tape is tape that's never been fluxed.
Yeah.
Oh, well. Anyway, at the end of the tapes, there's a section that is completely...
Okay, I got it. I'm very slow.
There's the tape is clear. I mean, you can see right through it. All the
all the oxide has been
worn off because as it turns around, the air collapses, and there is a brief moment while it rubs before it gets up to speed. So if you pick a number, 6 feet of tape, you ended up with 6 or 8 inches of clear tape on the two ends, and absolutely
Nothing. No sign of wear in between.
No sign of wear whatsoever. It was really, and so damn old Wes Clark, he would take to putting cigarette ashes in the rotating tape just to prove to people how. Then he would take the tape off and he'd roll it out on the floor and then roll it back up on the reel and put it back in. It would still work. See, which of course that's great. I mean that's all right. So they go off and they build that
Link computer.
The Link computer. Charlie puts together this link tape, and Wes cooked up a different mark track because the link tape had a much more shorter word size, and the link tape would only read in one direction. You could go down and read the mark track either way, of course, right. But once you wanted to write on it, you had to only go one way, and normal type engineering decisions.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so now Ken and Harlan go off and found DEC, and I'm still a bachelor, and I go over there nights to DEC to just meet my old friends, and I break into the mill every night. Well, not every time I went there, which was maybe once a month or something. And I would climb in and climb up the elevator shaft or one way or another, and what's his name? Starting up a company, everybody does a lot of jobs because you've only got 3 or 4 vice presidents, and so one of them has to clean the latrine, and one of them has to take care of PR, and one guy was in charge of security. But the mill is as porous as they come. I mean, there's holes everywhere. Not so much anymore, but it was true then. So I had fun climbing up the elevator shaft. Here I am at night, and they're always working at night, all night, every night. That's just the way it is. So anyway, they said to me, you stay back at Lincoln and we'll hire you in a couple of years, but you stay up with the technology. And that's just what did happen. Pretty soon Dick Best invites me out for lunch and says, we'll offer you the princely salary of $9,000 a year, which was huge. And I said, sure. I mean, there was no surprises anyway, and went to work for Dick. My technician at Lincoln said, anybody who works here longer than, I forget what his number was, 5 or 7 years is a successful failure. And it was true. You get into the government bureaucratical sort of locked in situations, all very pleasant, like in a womb, but yes. But nothing much happens.
If we back up to Lincoln for a moment.
Sure.
When did you and Ken first cross paths? When did you meet him in Lincoln? Was that right off? Was he?
No, I don't think so. No, he was over at MIT all the time, and he would come out to Lincoln once in a while because of the
memory test
computer.
Right.
And then it seems to me he had a little something to do with TX2, but basically just passing in the aisle.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Wes Clark had hired me into Lincoln because I made an interview trip up here after being rejected from the school, and he took me on a tour around TX2 area, and I got so excited, and like I'm excited right now, and Wes picked that up, and he wrote the nicest letter, which I didn't see for 15 years. When he was cleaning out his files, and I've got it somewhere, and it just said, we got to hire this guy, is what the letter said.
Yeah.
And that was nice.
Now, was there any interaction with you and the SAGE project?
No. I would go back to the back room and look at the blue lights and stuff, but no, not really. Okay, let's see. So I don't think
Yeah, so how long were so you were at Lincoln for about 2 years?
Oh, no, 7 years.
7 years, I'm sorry.
No, from 1955 to 60 or 61, so
Okay.
5 years.
Yes, all right.
Roughly
Yeah.
5 years.
Okay.
And so anyway, they hired me over to DEC, and I made them promise I don't want to see another tape drive in my life.
You cannot hire me to do a tape drive.
Right. And they said, okay, we won't. You know, you're a good guy. You got talent. We can use you.
Lots of other.
Well, sure enough, they well, no, they got a guy to do what was going to become DEC tape. And I called him the Big Galoot. Very nice guy. Couldn't engineer his way out of a paper bag. And so one day I'm sitting there jumping up and complaining. And Ken is there. And I'm sure he set it up. I mean, I don't really know, but he must have. Anyway, I said, Jesus, that guy is crazy. He's doing this and that and the other thing, and he should be doing that and this and this. And Ken says, oh, you think you could do better? Hell yeah. Oh, damn. I was caught right there.
Very clever.
However, I got to sort of replicate link tape the way I wanted to do it.
Yes.
With no gears. The only thing I didn't do, which I wish I would have, I used relays to do the off and on. It solid state was coming up enough so that it should have been that, but you don't get everything right. And the next, jumping ahead now a little bit, and the Mark track, I had to design the electronics. Well, design, I mean, Dick Best saying do it that way, but then tweaking. And I'm in there one night. Oh, wait a minute, little story ahead of time. So the question now was, as a commercial product, what do you want this drive to do? Do you want it to be a lot of storage, which make a longer tape? Do you want it to be faster access, which makes it, you want to go quicker, but now you can't slow down when you come up to the right block, so it's inefficient. Do you want the tape wider so that you can put more than just 3 logical tracks on it, but now it's going to cost you more, etc. So I got all 12 DEC salesmen in a room at once and went through that kind of a drill. And they said, oh, okay, well, maybe we'll tell you sometime or whatever, because they didn't know yet. And that's fine. Well, okay, now fast forward a year and a half, and it's midnight, and Harlan Anderson, and I'm sitting there tweaking 2 more puffs on this one capacitor to make it so the phase was right, and all this stuff. And Harlan says, oh, there it is. It's not delivered yet. I said, what's not delivered? Well, we're making this, we made a sale to Key Corporation, and it was supposed to be delivered a while back. But nobody told me. Well, what were the specs? Well, of course, it was the fastest, the widest, the most.
They picked all of
all the.
None of the trade-offs.
None of the trade-offs. But they got what they got, which was basically the only invention, except for doing the mechanics right, was I did cook up a better shift register code because we had more bits to work with. The word length was longer, and so you could the shift register that did the reading was 24 bits long. I don't know, 8 times 3, I guess. So you could have more combinations, and then I wrote a program for the PDP-8 and ran it all weekend, and it came out with exactly 7 tracks, 3 of which were complements of each other, and then one in the middle that had 1 more feature. So that's the one we used. So that's what the patent's about, is that particular shift register code. For a little while, I was for 15 minutes, I was the world's expert on magnetic tape heads that simultaneously read and wrote, which is pretty tough.
Very tricky.
Yeah, because you're reading with a signal that's 50 dB higher than the one or lower than the one
you're writing with, yes.
Right. So you have to be pretty clever, I freely admit.
And duct tape now reads forward and backwards.
Oh, yes.
Writes forwards and backwards.
And it has end marks that the other one didn't have, and it's a much more polished job. So that was duct tape.
Wow, okay.
But you see, it's not me, it's just all these other people suggesting this and helping with that and so on. And I'm just busy having great fun tinkering.
Well, DEC ends up with the first really magnetic storage peripheral for really small computers, too.
Yeah. Of course, they soon got superseded by floppy disks.
Well,
but for a while,
yeah.
I don't quite know the timeline from the DEC point of view.
Yeah. Okay.
What happened next? I don't know. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So so I'm trying to figure out exactly where we are with the deck tape. So how long did you work on when you finally got sucked into?
Oh, that was maybe 6 months.
Yeah. Okay.
And then the actual project, of course, they sort of taper off, but it was probably a year and a half before everything. And I got together with a fellow named Lenny Hantman who did the software side of it, and he used to holler at me over the top of the offices, which couldn't happen later because they were all sealed up. But anyway, he'd say, "Tom, don't do that." "What?" "The shift register that you're trying to add a bit to won't work." And that's how closely the software and
goodness.
the hardware, I mean, he knew what I was thinking. And of course, I knew what he was thinking too, And that's the way to do it.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of successful projects that work just like that. So anyway, so now it winds down a bit, and I'm more of a starter and less of a runner, let's face it. But as long as there's people that can do a good job of running it, it's okay. So I forget the guy, I can see him sitting there, I forget his name. Anyway, he took over the tape business, and they cooked up some variations in the future. And Andy Knowles remembers this. I rolled up the rug I had on my floor, and wait a minute, no, there's the in-between. So now I find myself designing the machineries of production.
Okay.
Can't quite remember how I got into that. But anyway, the highlight was a back panel wiring machine. Now, Gerber made one, flatbed, vertical tool,
Absolutely.
XY table,
Yep.
and it kept missing pins. If the pins were just a little off, it came down and squished the pin.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it would. Yes,
It would.
of course.
See? So they had that problem. It was a very naggy, just not very often, but just enough to mess it all up.
Yeah.
So they said, "Tom, can you make a better one?" Oh.
Now, were they using Gerber?
Yeah, they were
using Gerber wire wrap.
Yeah, wire wrap.
That was a
Machines.
huge Gardner Denver,
Yes.
room size
Yes.
wrap machine, too.
Well, that's what I meant.
You meant Gardner Denver, not Gerber. Yes.
You're right.
Gerber did plotters, never
Right.
did
Gardner.
wire wrap
That's who I
machines.
meant.
Right.
So they said, "Well, can you do better?" Well, to compress it, what we ended up doing, I guess I'm responsible for this one, maybe not, was let the computer do what it does best, which is bookkeeping and wire paths. And then let the human do what they do best, which is eye-hand coordination. And so we flipped it up, and the whole panel moved up and down, and the XY moved sideways. That's the computer. But then there was a little notch where you stuck the gun, the wire wrap gun, and the person did that. Worked like a champ. And it was my first real education in machine and human.
And dividing up the.
If you divide it up right, you'd get it right. And this particular one worked very well. But I ended up an expert in hydraulic motors and all kinds of stuff. And I remember writing the inside code, what is, the machine language code, sort of. Well, it was on the PDP-8, and we
Probably was machine language. Yes, absolutely.
We discovered if you did an and, a nor here instead of an and then made the right changes around the rest of this very tight loop, like 4 or 5 instructions, all of a sudden we could get it to work as fast as it had to. And so that was fun. And so starting then and onward, I ended up, Gordon Bell used to say, any engineer who hasn't learned a new programming language each year is a failure. And by that time I was an engineering manager, and I said, Gordon, stop saying that, because all you do is put the fear in people's minds that the big boss is going to fire them because they didn't learn a programming language. On the other hand, there is some truth to it. And I ended up learning lots of different languages, again, as we said earlier in this discussion, not deeply,
but enough so.
But, use it. And then you can talk to the real programmer and know what you're talking about and stuff like that.
Yeah, and you could read his code.
Not necessarily. I couldn't read my own code a year later. That's when I learned that you really do have to document it. Yes. There should be a comment. My rule was and still is a comment on every single line.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that, anyway, never mind.
Yes.
So we did that. And the next thing was Ken wanted to build diodes in-house, that is, a fab lab in-house. And I don't know who did what in what order, but we ended up with a guy named Bob Brown who got furnaces and atmospheres and borons, and he taught me how to put gold wire connections onto the straight, the chips. And then now what do you do with them now that you got these little tiny diode chips? Well, you take a ceramic substrate and you paint on thick film resistors and thick film conductors, and then you set the diodes in, and there was a certain little particular circuit it's how they generated their bias. It was just three diodes in series, not very complicated. So it sort of lended itself to, and for a little while we produced up in the top floor, hot, miserable hot, with all these furnaces, but it didn't work because by this time I was working for Pete Kaufman, and he's a wonderful guy. Anyway, he got me to every month figure out how much they actually cost. That is overhead, return on investment, all that stuff.
Yes,
and it was fairly clear that it wasn't a good idea. So he very cleverly got me to stop my own project. And that's a little oversimplified, but it's a lesson to learn. If you're you can do it without crushing the person by going in and saying, that's the end.
Cancel it, yes.
Yeah, you can do it. And I learned it, I learned it later. Used the knowledge later. Anyway, so now it's where I mentioned a moment ago. The next job was to hook computers to telephone lines. And Dick Best had cooked up what would now be a UART, but it was a great big old panel with discrete parts and all that.
Yeah, right.
And the design has never changed really in 50 years, for God's sake. Anyway, so I went down and reported to work for Andy Knowles to hook computers to telephone lines. And at some point right in here, we got the Puerto Rico plant going. And they did want a teletype connection between the plant and here.
Yes.
Only computers on the end, not people.
Right.
And so sure enough, at 40 baud, I think it was 40, and I'll swear it was down the top wire of the barbed wire fence and back through ground, the loop, and it would. I went down to, and modems had just increased in speed to 300 baud.
Okay.
The telephone, the audio modems.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of it all. I remember going down to New York to Broad Street where AT&T or somebody has, and here's a whole room just full of paper tape, and the reels are like this big, going chugga 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 chugga, and then they would lead the tape over to the outbound, and the switching.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think it was
switching
probably a Western Union switching center.
Yeah, and the switching was to move the tape physically, or you didn't. They were clever. They didn't actually. They just fed it into the next thing down the line. Well, no wonder it took a long time to get a bit from here to there.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's
Okay.
beside the.
So let's see. Where were we?
We've done the flip chip.
Yeah.
Flip chip. Talked about that.
Yeah, and then they called them straights, spelled wrong, and then flip chip was actually the name of something else, which a chip was flipped and it had buttons on it. But somehow or another, Ken thought that was sexy, and so he called these things flip chips.
Okay.
But I always thought it was inappropriate. However, the period didn't last very long. We quit doing it because it was a wrong thing to do for the technology of the time.
Okay, and
So-
it was figured out from an economic point of view.
Yeah,
and
Kaufman made me run a. Well, it was a card sorting machine and punch cards and all that. Even though anyway, the numbers didn't hold up. It wasn't worth doing. You could buy it, and of course, not very long after, you could buy the whole damn computer on the thumb.
Yes, right.
On a chip the size of your thumb.
But integrated circuits were clearly.
Yeah, well, yeah. But they hadn't quite got there yet, but we were just too late to catch before it all.
Yeah. Well, I'm not supposed to talk. Whoops. Hold on. Sorry. I'm not supposed to talk, but I have to, just because we're in a conversation here, from Ed DeCastro's interview, he, of course, was being told he ought to use the flip chip for the PDP-8 when he was designing the PDP-8 about the same time. But he didn't believe that DEC would ever get it going. And
He was right.
Well, he was right. And so he designed it using discrete components. And then but then the challenge was, how was he going to get it on the boards? Because the form factor was fixed.
Sure.
Okay.
And discretes take a lot of space.
Yeah. And so he got found a layout guy who was, laying out the circuit board that was really good. I can't remember his name. He took him with him to Data General because he was so good, and he managed to squeeze the CPU onto the boards.
Oh, that's it. I never knew that. That's
Yeah, I thought you'd be interested in that. That's another flip chip story. Anyway, but I'm not supposed to be talking, so
No, that's okay.
You're supposed to talk now.
Well, that's all right.
Okay.
So anyway, let's see. We're at the end of my manufacturing machineries of production phase.
Okay.
And we're switching, and I'm going down to work for Andy Knowles with my rug on my shoulder. Andy used to tell that story over and over. He says, how many employees rolled up the rug in their other office, put it on their shoulder, and came down? It was a Navajo ruggish type thing, but anyway.
Okay. Now, you have to tell us who is Andy Knowles and what was he doing at the
Okay,
time?
Andy Knowles was running the PDP-11 world at that point, and I guess his mandate was actually broader than that, but it was PDP-11 right then, and he was a very good designer, marketeer, a little bit abrasive, not very. Was drunk all the time in the evenings. Ended up dying on the cirrhosis of the liver or something.
Okay.
I used to go over to his house, and we'd drink, and I'd get drunk enough, and he'd stay at his house overnight rather than going back to see Joan. And Joan was just as happy that I didn't drive on the streets. But anyway, but he was a jewel. And there's the first, as I remember it, and I might be remembering wrong, the first was, as I said, to get up computers hooked to telephone lines. It was just about the time. It wasn't that it hadn't been done, it was just time to get it done right.
Yes.
And one of the things that happened in that period, he and I went on a business trip to a sales meeting in England, and I was driving him on the left side of the road, scared shitless. And he said, "That's too bad. You're going to drive. I'm the boss." So we made it. But anyway, the sales meeting was in the Midlands somewhere. It was either Birmingham. I think it was Birmingham. Anyway, it was in a hotel, and the first 2 or 3 days, I was just their pet engineer. You get the engineer up in front of the sales type and put him on a marionette strings and tell him to open and shut his mouth, and they're supposed to get all excited about what's going to happen soon, yes, or almost, or whatever. So at the end of a day or two of the sales meeting, I had done my thing. Sales type's there, and I can see the guy, and it wasn't Petterschmidt, because he was higher up, but the local guy said, "I just got a phone call from Delft, and they're having a hooking the computers to the telephone lines conference down there. And one of their panel people got sick. Would you go down to Delft tomorrow and be the panel person?" Okay, well, sounds like fun. And so sure enough, got on a plane. It's just a few minutes, really. Go to Delft and get into the town center. And I knew I had to go to the university to Joe Blow, and that's where the conference would be. So I'm walking down the street, and I said, "Where's the name of the place, the building?" So, don't know. It's sort of up that way. Okay, walk along a while and say, another person, "Don't know. It's over this way." Turns out that Delft University is all the way around you if you're in Delft.
Yes.
Just the way it works out.
Yeah.
Because, so there's no direction that you can. And so I went into this bar and said, "What?" And he got me in a car and drove me right to the place. It was only 4 or 5 blocks. Anyway, I'm leading up to a story. So it goes well, and I'm a panel member, blah blah blah. At lunchtime, a fella comes up to me and taps me on the shoulder. He says, "My name is Baret Cheba, and I'm from Hungary. And would you like to see a PDP-8 that was not made by Digital Equipment Corporation?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, well, sure. I mean, And he says, "Actually, we have better software, and our tape machines run faster and stuff." So it turns out this company that was running this session had alternate every 6 months a meeting in Delft or in Slough. And I don't know about you, but Slough is a slough. It's west of London. And they said, "You did a good enough job. We'd like to invite you back for next year." So I went to Ken. I said, hey, look, I just as soon take some vacation, take the wife, not all Deck's expenses. And I'm curious, and it's after all behind the Iron Curtain. So what would is that all right? He says, oh yeah, everything that we know has been stolen. Everybody already knows. So sure, go in peace. So I did. Well, so I get there. This is 6 months later now.
What country is this in?
Hungary.
Hungary.
Budapest.
Okay.
And so I sent a telegram to my friend Barat Sheba about 3 weeks ahead of time, and I said, wait a minute now, it's behind the Iron Curtain. I've got to be careful what I say. So the telegram said, my wife and I are arriving on the 25th of August, and we wish to take you to dinner. That's all it said. And later on, he says, you have no idea what consternation that caused in the corporate, because they, of course, processed the note. They couldn't decide whether it was a secret coded message or whether it was, just didn't know. And of course, he couldn't say very much because he didn't know either, really. It's just that I was going to show up. Anyway, we get there, and he does a wonderful job of a long weekend and the sightseeing and, stuff like that. And at one point, I said to him, and so Monday morning, we get in his car, he drives up, and we get in his car, and we head off for the headquarters of Videoton Corporation, which is the major television manufacturer at that point. And the goal, the goal is, I didn't realize this till I got there, is to convince his marketing manager that they should pay us royalties or whatever for PDP-8s, not steal them. But then they would make all the peripherals. And I said, well, this is communist world, I guess. And I've heard that, only one company gets picked out to do each different thing. It's a planned economy. So how do you know you're going to be the one that gets to do the disk drives, whatever? And he says, it will be decided. And I thought, that's pretty good. Anyway, so I find myself at this long table, and I've never seen this before. It's lined with 8 or 9 people on this side, 8 or 9 people on this side. I'm sitting and the head of the table is right there. I'm on his right hand. And my friend, Bart, is on his left hand. And Bart's trying to convince his boss that the PDP-8s are worth anything. And the boss cannot figure that out. He says, well, what do they do? And my German was a little better than his English. So we actually did pidgin German to do it. Anyway, I said, well, we've got them on the back of tractors picking blueberries, and he says, you do? He just sort of didn't get it. Anyway, now comes the epilogue is, I come back home and I say to Ted Johnson, who never made a decision in his life as far as I can tell. Nice guy, though. And I say, does this make sense? And Ted, being kind of a internationalist, thinks it does make sense. Well, a little later, like 2 or 3, 6 weeks, Ted gets this message from Vani Papa, who is the East Block salesman. Don't you ever let Stockebrand in here again. He talks about things behind my back. I didn't know anything about it. I was just going on I was going to take vacation, and if this guy wants to, use me to help him out, that's all right with me. I don't know. And he goes on and on and on. And so that's when I learned the lesson. You got to always have the salesman in the territory know what's going on, which is fine. It's just that, it just didn't. But so anyway, for about another 6 months, I was the East Bloc expert. And sure enough, the Bulgarians show up at deck with one of these teams of trade teams. And they say, we want to sell you chips, forget LED drivers or I don't know, some chip. And I say, oh, well, okay. I mean, Bulgaria is well known to be really backward and stuff, but we'll see. Do you have some literature? Well, no, we don't have any literature. Well, could I, maybe you've got a technician and he's got a notebook and maybe we can get it translated and learn what you're trying to sell. Yeah, they said, well, yeah, we could do that, but we ought to tell you, they said, that we actually make a product and it actually works. You guys publish the literature, you don't necessarily make the product. It's called vaporware,
Yes.
So I thought, well, that's an interesting twist. Anyway, so that was a little piece of the linked with Andy Knoll, and it's one of the bigger stories in my life, like the Tux story or the driving around Europe on a bicycle one summer story, which we don't have on the tape, but that's okay.
So did Andy want to be in the terminals business? Is that how the VT50 got started?
Well, now that's a very good question. How did he set me off to doing? Yeah, I guess he did. I guess he wanted to have a proprietary terminal that would work in his environment. So anyway, I did start a little group, and we did start making, first the VT50, and Russ Stone was the main designer guy, really, and he would design and make specifications this thick, and I'd say, hey, look, what are we going to do? And our goal on the very first one was to make everything on a single board, which would go inside, and the board would actually stick out, and the keyboard would be on that same board.
Wow.
See?
So he was going to lower costs that way. Is that right?
Yeah.
That was the idea.
The boards were going to be single-sided.
Wow.
And of course, you got to have jumpers. So sure enough, a lot of jumpers to make you topology problem. And we set about to get manufacturing to make it. I didn't learn till later. They balked. They didn't want a single-sided board with lots of jumpers.
They said that wasn't the way to do it.
Well, they didn't say anything. They just sort of didn't take up the, let's do this way. But it did get me out to the Westminster plant and stuff, and got started in what came next after going out to Albuquerque. And so anyway, that was the VT50, and I went at this point, or maybe it's 52 point, and I went to Peter Christie, who was running the PDP 10s at that time, I think. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the 6, I think it was the 10. Yeah, it was 10. And I said to him, there's a lot of features that you need, and a lot of them can be borrowed from the teletype industry. And the one I remember particularly, there is a code you can send, it's called X on and X off. So you could stop the flow and then start it up again, which when the machine didn't match in speed, the terminal, it's the way to synchronize. And later, Peter said, no, I'm not interested. From Andy's point of view, it would be an additional market. Not just, but Peter rejected it. And several years later, maybe 8 years later, he came around. He says, that's one of the bigger mistakes I ever made, was to not accept the VT, because by that time we'd got to the VT52, which turned out to be a sensible beta test, really. I mean, we sold a bunch of them, but and it laid the groundwork for what Ned Forrester did the VT100, which was still just a VT52, but he did a couple of real nice things. One of the things, he had smooth scrolling, which is now ubiquitous.
Yes.
But at that time, it was jump, jump.
Oh, really?
Which, if you went to the next cartridge turn, everything went click. And that's hard on the eyes if you're trying to do editing. It's peculiar. Anyway, and I had big fights with Forrester because he would lie about what the potential production was. And we were both right. That is, it was nowhere near as much as he said in the first year or two. But then pretty soon it just blew up, and it became the standard of the industry. But
now, why was he lying about it? I mean, why?
Oh, he had to tell the boss it'd be $1 million so he'd get more money to do the development, which is a standard. Okay. Management and engineering collude very nicely, and they both know what they're doing, which is the engineer says wonderful things and great specs, and management says, oh, I guess I want that, but they can't make a decision because they haven't seen a product yet or whatever. So what their part of the collusion is to get you far enough down the pike with money so that they later can look at the success or whatever, it looks better now. Now they've got an easy decision. Yeah, we'll put some more money in it. And the engineer knows perfectly well about this whole story that he's never, the bottom line in practice is you got to be willing to run over budget. And one of the mistakes I made as a manager is it was just too square. If the boss, and Cabernetti was the one I think of, but anyway, said you should run on a $1.4 million, I really, really tried very hard to stay within it. But you shouldn't. You should overshoot so that the manager, now his risk level is down enough that everything continues. And that collusion is well understood by managers and engineers in general.
And part of that is forecasting much higher volumes.
Yes. Part of that. That's where this little episode got started. Yeah. But I'm sure you're well aware of all that. I mean, that's just the way it's done.
At Tech. And maybe other places.
Yeah, well, if you don't do some kind of collusion like that, progress doesn't happen because, it's a question of who takes the risk when in the whole development cycle. And you can't get a boss to take the risk early. But engineers, of course, that's what they're for. Right. So each one kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge on the whole thing. And it wasn't stated exactly. It's just I sort of realized all this later. Anyway, so now at one point Russ Stone had us design the VT52 or well, maybe it was going to be the 3 or the 4, I don't know, with a place to put a printer, because at that point you didn't have printers in terminals. But we had run across a fax machine idea, which in the end all it did was spew out loads of wet toilet paper. And we even made a corrugated edge in the design of the plastic, and so that you could tear the paper off.
Oh my goodness.
Which of course never got used because in the pocket where this was going to go, I mean, it was, well, what did happen was Bob Annenson was the product sales / marketing. And he said, Tom, we did find a printer that printed on, I guess it used sparks on a paper with a surface that got eroded when the spark came, very low contrast. Yeah. And we did, I can't remember now, we'd have to ask Annenson. Anyway, he said, too bad we didn't think of that first, because 6 months prior, that would have been the first thing on the market that had a print screen button.
Yes.
So you could
print what you see.
Yeah. Yes. So just transfer the bits, and we could easily have done it. And we tried, but we tried with the wrong mechanism. But now, somewhere in here, Julius, and you'll find out from him tomorrow, but I made a proposal, which he showed me years later. There was we'll say, VT52A, B, and C. And we made space underneath in the first two, so you could plug in, you know, those blocks we had that were green and this tall, and they had about, I don't know, a 3 and 3 or 4, I guess 4 side by side.
2 by 4.
2 by 4, yeah. Anyway,
This is a little card. This is a connector block.
It's a back panel, but it's just a single box. Block.
Yeah, but in a block.
Yeah.
And then you can put
and
4 cards.
The goal was that one of these days they're going to get a PDP-8-like device which we can put in there. And Julius pointed out later, again we missed it, that would have been a PC.
Yeah.
You know, and it's who knows whether if we'd ever plug stuff in there that, see, at the instant the modules didn't exist.
Yes.
The machinery kind of existed. There was PDP-8s, but
nobody had shrunk it so that you could put a single card PDP-8 there.
Well, or even
there was the WT78, which I think was the VT52 plus a pair of floppies underneath, and a PDP-8 which did word processing, right?
Oh, I forgot all about that. Wasn't in my world, so I didn't.
I don't know who did that. Jack Gilmore or somebody like that did that, because it was a standalone word processor, and they won't take on Wang with it. I did okay for a while.
Yeah. I vaguely, and there was a guy who built a console that had a combination of 2 or 3 things. It was a camel designed by a committee, or a horse. You know, it didn't quite work either. But it was 2 different operating systems in the same console.
Okay.
And of course, you know, how are you going to do it? And I don't. Does that ring any bells with you?
Not with me.
No, I don't think I remember that. I don't remember that.
Okay. Well, anyway, so that happened. And then one day I'm out on vacation and I come back and my office is gone. And they'd moved our little group over 4 or 5 doors and taken away the secretary. Well, taken away is the wrong word. But anyway, I was out of a job.
Oh.
And because, you know, that was over now, and it was off with Forrester, and things are going fine. But again, that's the nice thing about tech. You can be without a job within the company, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're fired. However, what they said was, and I cannot remember this guy's name, and you know why. It's one of these, he just didn't realize everybody's territorial. And the worst thing you can do to somebody is have them come home to no desk, or even simpler things like all your stuff's taken off the wall, or, you know, that's a blow psychologically. Right. Anyway, so I said, what? And he says, well, you have a choice. We can promote you to run the whole printer group. By this time, I guess I'd had a toehold in that somehow. Or we can send you off to Phoenix and you can run the support engineering for manufacturing. Because see, by this time I'd been out to manufacturings and stuff as part. And the manufacturing people, we loved each other. They like an engineer that can actually do something. And I like manufacturing people that'll look a little bit open. Anyway, so I thought about it a very short time, a day or so. I said, I'm not cut out to run a printer group. First of all, I'm already at my level of incompetence as far as managing people. 2 or 3, maybe even 8 or 9, but come on, a whole group. And if I could just remember this guy, I can see him standing there. He was ran across him actually in a hardware store up north of here some years ago. Anyway, so I picked go to Phoenix. Well, just as we go out to Phoenix with Joan and start looking at houses, and we wandering around the desert, and the real estate dealer had a pistol. And what's that for? Oh, that's to get the rattlesnakes. Okay. The town was called Carefree. And it's about whatever. 20,
I know where that is. Yes.
20 miles north of Phoenix, And just as we were doing that, Bill Hansen bought the Albuquerque plant from Singer Corporation. And all of a sudden, if I was going to go and, by the way, back on the main track for a second, doing production line support engineering is great. It's completely different from design. Design, you get to change anything you want. Right. You change this, we can change this over here. Now it'll all kind of work together. Can't do that in production. It's in production. Yeah. And just because the vendor forgot how to make his transistors, there's no excuse. You're within really severe bounds. But that's another challenge that is great. I mean, Yeah. So I found myself later trying to tell people that it's like the Army. It's a good thing if you just sort of look at it right. Anyway, so the plant gets bought, and now I think it was Puffer says to me, why don't you run both support engineering groups, hire somebody for the other plant. And
what was the other plant going to do? What were they going to do in Albuquerque, and what were they doing in Phoenix? That would help give some context.
Yes, it would.
I think Phoenix was the terminal. It became the terminals.
Yes, the terminals ended up in Phoenix, and what's the next small PDP 11 2019 62 whatever.
LSI 11.
Something like that.
1105?
Maybe. What I remember doing for sure is I had built a big box, heat, and we would take the modules for this product, shove them in there for a week. And I wrote in Mumps code, which was an eye-opener. It was the first code I'd run across that you didn't have to specify ahead of time the length of every
variable. Yes.
Every variable. You just dream the variable up 2 months later, and it drops into there's a name for that kind of code.
Okay.
And it's very common now. It's like Lisp code.
Yeah.
Anyway, and what we did is we baked them, and we knew about what they call the bathtub curve. If you draw error rate on a logarithmic scale, 1 hour, 10 hours, 100 hours, 1,000 hours, all equal size, and you plot failure rates, it drops rather abruptly in the first few of these periods, and then it levels out, and then it begins to wear out, in effect.
Out there
10 years later. And of course, wearing out often is just heat. It's been hot for a long time.
Yeah.
So what we did is we generated the beginnings of that curve automatically in this system. And, I built that sort of.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So the all the modules in the system, I mean, there's heat in this. Yeah, there's heat in the room, but the modules are also all running, correct?
All running.
Yeah.
And the program is running and going through some kind of a stupid loop.
So that you can tell when there's a failure.
Yeah, sure.
Loop stops. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, or
whatever
it does.
Whatever it does. Okay.
It was interesting. The production line had the beginnings of automatic testing in which they would plug in the module and it would put voltages up, down, this, and look to see what was coming out over here. And this is another one of these human interface. And the management, the plant, I guess, manager, said something like, well, you can't expect these people to know that when this voltage is low, it's because the diodes failed. They don't even know what a diode is. Yeah. No. You put it in there and you publish the input and the output. Somebody fixes it, which may not be the production person. As soon as it gets fixed once, that pattern, everybody know, all the production line people know that pattern means this diode is bad. So it worked, again, it really worked slick. They had no idea.
They couldn't figure out.
They just made pattern recognition.
Yes.
Between inputs and outputs and stuff, and the production went way up, and the errors got fixed right away, and things got shipped, which was another example of the same thing.
Same idea, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so and then backing up just a hair. So Albuquerque gets created, and Bob Puffer says, you have to go to Phoenix. I've told you this, I guess. Anyway, you have to go to Phoenix, which, in my opinion, is a little piece of Los Angeles that got torn off and shoved 500 miles east. And it's terrible. But Albuquerque is a hick town and an old ranch, and it's, much more fun.
Yeah.
So Puffer says, go. I don't remember that I even responded. I just went to Albuquerque because, you have to hire somebody in the other plant.
Right, yes.
And Joe Bitto in the other plant. And then I think it was Matt Tynan, I don't know, in this plant. And then I promoted them to work for my boss back east. And now I'm free again. I've got nobody working for me in a big empty room. And the goal was but the end of my direct deck career, in hindsight, putting it together, is developing more display stuff. What color the phosphor? Turns out Ken has slow eyeballs. Even if it only flickers at 25 hertz, he can't see it. And so I had to do some explaining to him. But there are a couple of interesting things. One is memory. Not a problem anymore, but still a problem then. If you make a dot matrix character 5x7, it looks terrible. If you're trying
not enough
but
resolution.
If you modify it, rather than making 16x16 or whatever, a lot more memory, if you modulate the density, the brightness of each of the 35 dots, all of a sudden your brain puts in the serifs and the sharp edges. And a little tiny side story for that. If you can do this. Let's say you're writing a note to your girlfriend or whatever, and somebody comes up behind you that you don't want them to know that you just signed your name. Well, that's not a good way. For some reason, you don't want them to know that you just signed your name. No, that you just wrote some phrase. You just take your pen, immediately sign your name right on top of it. Completely obliterates it, even though it's rather sparse in terms of actual. Try it sometime. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Your brain just cannot cope with a big puzzle of stuff. On the other hand, if you just put a sort of a vague cloudish type thing, your brain creates images like crazy. Look at the clouds in the sky. It does a great job. So if you brightness modulate the 35 dots, which takes fewer total bits in all than putting 16x16. Now,
how do you modulate these?
What's
driving the modulation? I don't know.
Well,
I'm not understanding.
It's a character map, and you make the character map in the following way. You take a very sharp, high serif letter A, B, C, with serifs on the end and really quite crisp. You lay that down on a 5x7 matrix, and you draw a little circle around each pixel, and you modulate the intensity of that pixel according to the fraction of this sharp image which overlaps the dot.
Bingo.
Okay? Works fine. Well, works. You put it up, and my God, you look closely, and it's just sort of a bunch of fuzz. You back off, and all of a sudden, your brain puts in the sharp edges and the corners and everything. Here's the problem, which we didn't realize for a while. It's hard on your brain. It's a very fatiguing thing to read fonts generated in that manner. But man, are they spectacular for the amount of
cost behind the mechanism. Yeah.
Now, as a petabyte costs 10 cents, who cares? but anyway, that was so phosphors, that kind of thing. And then the next thing we did, we cooked up what was called bit blip at the time, which was the first two-dimensional transfers within memory to make it so that you could quickly draw more complex things with simpler things. And I forget there was a name of an actual product. We only made the breadboard or the which we were going to put it out, and it migrated itself back to Maynard and got built all right. So at that point we were serving a correct function, being sort of product development. And I don't want to call it research.
Advanced development.
Advanced development, yeah. So we were doing sort of the proper thing, and Ken would come out, and Andy would come out and sort of pat people on the head, including me, and then we'd take them all up the top of the mountain and say, Andy, going up in altitude from 6,000 feet, and by the way, you're used to sea level, to 11,000 feet is worth at least one and sometimes two drinks. Oh, no, I can drink as much as the next. And of course, he would get absolutely crazy drunk. Yeah. But he's too macho to admit, that he couldn't cope. Anyway, never mind.
That was good.
So anyway, now, then what happened, and I'm not sure whether this was a mistake of mine or what, I think maybe it's everything. Both, partly it's being far away. If you're going to be far away like that, you have to have a strong mentor.
Yes.
And people who know me say, well, we don't have to manage Tom. He'll do fine and stuff. So I had a whole succession of pleasant bosses. They were fine. One of them was Kathy, somebody, very nice. And I guess lost some sort of connection to what the real needs back there. Of course, when you're in advanced development, it's a mutual process. Who cooks up the real needs? It's partly you saying, this is possible, and it's partly the other person saying, this we need. Yep. And they either do or don't get together. Yep. And unless somebody works on that, they don't get together. Because just enough off. And that's one thing I should have. Now, for a little while, Julius was really good in this area for me, because it was earlier than the time we're talking about right now. But anyway, Julius was a real good support guy. He says I never worked for him. I say I worked for him happily for a year, and I don't know what the truth is. But you can see if nobody gave a shit who Tom worked for, maybe nobody knows, including Tom. Anyway, just to get to the end of it. So we started doing what I perceive now to be kind of wrong things. We started to invent, well, that's not right either. We made a huge display, 15-inch display of quality and definition enough to put X-rays on, even though it was fundamentally digital coming this way.
Yeah, right.
And of course, what happened is that got overtaken fairly soon by flat screens. And all the stuff about analog jitter and the edges having this kind of stuff going on, a really tough analog design problem just to get everything rock stable. It's pretty hard to do. So however, right in about, one more, there's just 2 steps more and we're done. So the guy who I mentioned in here,
Chuck Blasey?
No.
John Curtis? Van
No, further along. The little guy about this tall. Well, anyway, the name will come up in a moment.
All right. Yeah.
That's
fine.
And he sent a team out to do an engineering design review on short notice on a project which was a
You were talking to Dick Clayton?
Dick Clayton.
Okay.
And he, I don't think I was working for him. Oh, yes, that's it. I was working for a guy who, that's another one of these names you erase because he had been assigned to be my boss, and for 2 full years, he never said a thing to me.
Yep.
Yeah, of course, he called on the phone and said hello, but he never gave me any feedback. You're failing, you're succeeding, you should be doing this instead of that.
Yes,
or
right.
What you're doing.
No guidance.
What you're doing is right. Didn't get a thing. It was the low point in my psychological life, and it surprised the hell out of me. I thought, well, I'm a confident. Everybody needs it. And I just sunk down to about here, so I was making poor decisions, I'm sure, on what products to kind of push and present. Anyway, so Dick Clayton sent out a team, and we failed the design review.
Now, what was the product?
It was a very high-speed display, boob tube. I remember it ran at 80 kilohertz instead of only 15, and it was to get fast stuff and a lot of it on a screen. A powerful display, but of course built on the wrong technology because.
Well, it was still a CRT with
CRT.
analog
Yes.
electronics. Okay.
Yeah, and the fellow I had working for it, he was much less competent than I thought. For instance, at one point, I said, "Why did you pick that size inductor?" He says, "Oh, well, I looked in the book, and one book says it should be this big, and the other book says, following a little different line of reasoning, says it should be 1/4 the size, so I just split it in the middle." Wait a minute. You really need to understand why that book said what it said.
And why that was
said what it said, and decide what you're going to do about it. And and it was my fault, because I shouldn't have let him get that far. But anyway, I started to sneak up on the idea of him leaving the company, and I'm not sure whether this was just before. It must have been after the design review. Anyway, he magically disappeared to deck up in Colorado Springs all by himself. I didn't say anything. Now I get a new boss named Cabernetti. I forget what Cabernetti's first name was.
Leo.
Huh?
Leo, right? Leo Cabernet?
Doesn't quite seem right, but
Maybe
close.
Keep going, yeah.
Anyway, his personal goal, which I didn't realize, but I fell into it. You're out there to reduce the price of the ongoing product by 5% so we can increase the sales by 10%, or whatever number you like. We weren't doing that. We were trying out different things and getting it wrong.
You were looking for new function.
Well, and we got it wrong, sure enough. Anyway, one day, there's one little piece of it before it ends. What we were doing by this time, when we were kind of out of the display business, we were doing what is now called virtual reality. But computers weren't fast enough to make that work at that time. It was 1989, maybe, something like that. Yeah. And they're just barely fast enough. I remember Ivan Sutherland. I don't know if you know him.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, he had the sword of Damocles from the head up on the ceiling with some three-dimensional sensors, and then on your head some more three-dimensional, so that you knew not only where your head was, but which way it was looking. And with that as an input, he programmed, it turned out to be just a stick figure of a house, just a line drawing, but three-dimensional. And if you moved your head very fast, it blew up. And then you waited for a minute, it all assembled itself. But you could walk through the window and turn around and look at the back side of the wall. And but very, very simple because you just couldn't compute. And then the next thing I remember is what I told you a little earlier. There was a 3D thing in which there was I forget who did this. It wasn't us. Chessboard, sort of think of it as suspended in space.
Yes.
And in your hand you had a ball, and you could push the pieces around.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And again, way too slow, but still. And the thing I remember most, you had what is now called Oculus Rift and stuff, but then it was 2-inch tubes and 3 prisms. You know?
Okay. Yeah.
And you could, if you look down on the top of this chessboard, it was red and black squares. Mm-hmm. But if you laid down on the floor and looked up, they were green and white squares. That sticks in my mind, you know.
Okay.
And I remember Mike Morgenstern and Mike Lease, they were, somehow I was associated with them much earlier in the VT50 day. Right. But they got out there at some point. And Mike is the guy that got down on the floor. He said, "Hey, Tom, look here." Well, since the computers weren't fast enough, what we thought is what we'll do is we'll make a joystick, only not a joystick, like your arm, multiply, you know, has
A bunch of degrees of freedom. Yes.
Yeah, but force feedback. So I even went out to the oil business, Houston, and if you think about it, the only thing they've got when they ping their transponders and put the echo down in the ground, the coming back echoes are simply a function of density variations as you go. That's all they had. I mean, now I guess they got other things, but that was it.
Yeah.
So it turns out that if you took this thing and you gave it force feedback and closed your eyes, you could feel the lumps and the salt domes and the rocks or the
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now we never got it far enough along because Houston people didn't quite believe why would these people know anything about our problems, and partly because again no sponsorship from Maynard for somebody to pick it up and think about it and support it. Anyway, at that point, Cabernetti calls up and says, this is 1990, December. Well, actually a month or two ahead of that, I guess. But how would you like to find jobs for all 23 people who work for you and yourself? Oh. Then he says, we can pretend you're 65 for the purpose of pensions and all that instead of just 60. And we were actually the second tranche of people that were starting to be sized down. So I got a real good deal. It was 2 weeks of pay for every year worked. So I got a year's salary in one lump sum, paid off the mortgage. And then they call up about a few months later and they say, you know, when we stopped your group, all the projects stopped. And we really wanted this one project. And would you please, this is another good story, would you please do it? And I said, no, because I signed a thing that says I cannot work for DEC or anybody else in the same capacity for the next 3 years or 2 or whatever it was. And they said, oh, don't worry. We'll get the BOD to waive that particular, and they did.
Okay.
So I grabbed my best software guy, who of course was out. At the moment, neither of us had settled down yet.
Yeah.
And grabbed him, and we did finish the project. Then I gave my bill, which was trivial, I mean, a couple $1,000, to Deck, and then I discovered the truth. I thought when I would hire a consultant, which I did once in a while, outside guy, that when I was marching his bill upstairs to the finance types,
Right.
I thought I was shortening the time from 30 days to 10 days, whenever their next cycle.
Yeah, right.
Their cycle is 90 days and longer if possible. So I didn't get paid, and I didn't get paid, and I didn't get paid. And then I even knew the people back there, secretary, oh, she's been on vacation for 2 weeks. Oh, okay. I mean, it was awful.
Yeah.
So, and this, of course, is part of Deck sliding downhill, I guess.
Yeah, running out of cash.
Yeah, right, whatever. So, and I had to reflect that when I first went with Deck, everything was 2% net 10.
Yeah.
And that 2%, do it each month, that adds up to a considerable, plus which you get your vendors back. They are eager to work for you because you actually pay them.
Yes.
And then I discovered, concurrently with this whole thing, that it became clear to me why we couldn't get people to come work for us again. But I never knew it.
Yeah.
Crazy me, I should have looked into it, I suppose, but I didn't. Okay. By this time, I got on the engineering committee, which was quite a nice honor. Had to go back every 2 or 3 months, whatever, to the engineering committee meeting. Big mucky bucks. Peter Christie was one of them. I forget who else was on the committee. But anyway, each time I would go back, I would, of course, stay for a few days and look around and check out stuff. It got quieter and quieter. Now, the old mill used to be bedlam, not that noisy, but people in
People
and out,
were
around.
moving.
Yeah.
They were.
They had walls, they had locks, push buttons, couldn't get in, had no idea what was going on. I'm sure the people in this cubicle didn't know what was going on over there. If you wanted to find out what was really going on in a general way, ask the secretaries.
Yeah.
They would tell you. And it was just so dismal. Oh. So, I don't know, you lived through some of that, I guess.
2 more years, 92.
Yeah, and I thought, oh, shit. So in a way, and Joe, when it did happen, when he called up, Joan says, take it!
She already had that feeling, yes, as to what's going on.
I think she was more global. But, I didn't realize how much the place was decaying.
Yes.
And people want to pick out why Deck failed, and I, of course, have no clue. My contribution, though, or thought, is Ken felt that he had a family he had to take care of, and he couldn't fire people. And to do it when he felt he had to, he'd move them off in an office with nothing in it. It's called Death Row. It was there around the corner, down. And they were supposed to figure out that they had 6 months to find, or any length of time, to find themselves a job. And they either did or didn't figure that out soon enough. And so that's my contribution, is he had and I guess the only other one I know, now of course a lot of people have a lot of opinions and stuff. The only, that plus one other is the only ones I know about, which is that he really didn't do any succession planning. And you just have to. And he'd done a wonderful job when the company, when I first joined, it was 330 people. When I left, it was 120,000 people. In the process of those years, he did reinvent himself 2 or 3 times, and a good job of it, too. Because I remember when we passed, 10 million or something, everybody was so happy and said, well, now it's a new company, and what's going to happen at 100 million or whatever, 50. But by 50, we're doing still all right. And that happened through, I'll say, 4 cycles of Ken's growth. But he finally ran out of growth, or what I think it's more simpler than that in a way. It's just if you don't do succession planning, it doesn't work. But that's all I know. Other people have, all kinds of theories, and Ed Schein wrote the book on it, and that's his theories. And you'll hear from Julius tomorrow what he thinks.
Well, I got my theories too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
of course.
Well,
Anybody's
I
there.
would like to hear them all, but on the other hand, I think the bottom line has to be it's complicated.
Oh, it is.
It's not just because Ted Johnson hates Jack Shields.
Right.
A couple more while I think of it, and then it's wound up for the deck part. If you want to talk a little bit about the future, or what happened next, because after all, it's been 20 years since this. Everybody that I know seems to have gotten on Ken's list, at least for a while, in which he calls up every few days and discusses whatever's on his mind. And I was on that list for a few months, and my secretary was so surprised. It's the president! He's calling you! Well, of course, she didn't know we were old buddies from,
Yeah, that you knew each other for years.
Yeah, sure. Ken used to say, Tom, you're a good designer. And the designer works by kind of going around the circle. You change this, and then that modifies this, which then you got to change this, and you just keep going around until it all comes. And he says, the difference between you and me is I go around the circle clockwise, and you go around the circle counterclockwise. So sure enough, we would hit way back. Now we're backed way up. We would hit occasional impasses, which the only thing for both of us to do would walk away.
Yeah, right.
Let's see. There was one other thought I had, but it either will or won't come back to me. I guess I'm done. Do you have follow-up questions for this phase of things?
Well, you were off. After DEC, you started. Maybe
Yeah.
while you were at DEC, you were inventing things and doing. Then you led to some mechanical engineering consulting and so on.
Yeah, we want to hear. Yeah, we want to keep
Well,
going.
okay. While I was at DEC, and in anticipation of my succession, I got myself a registered professional engineer's license in New Mexico. To do that, because I wanted to have a little company that I could throw stuff in as time went on. To do that, you had to take 2 tests. One was the so-called EIT, Engineering in Training, and the other one was the professional exam. And they were given every 6 months. Turns out the professional exam was on a Saturday and the EIT was on a Sunday. So they were sort of backward in a certain sense.
Yeah.
Now the EIT is 300 short questions, multiple choice questions. And if you're in school and it was open book, what's the units of viscosity? Slug foots per second squared? Well, if you're in school, right which page to turn to, there's the graph, and the graph is labeled second squared per slug feet. And you answer the question, and you get on to the next one. Well, if you've been out in the world for 30 years, you haven't got a clue. Okay, hold that thought. Now, the professional engineer's exam, however, is just the same as the word problems at the end of all the chapters, where they set up, and one of them I remember they wanted to have you figure out how much it was an ROI question, what should the tourist motel charge for rent if the following things cost this much.
And this much and this much.
And all that, see. So about 2 weeks before the test, you get a piece of paper that allows you to take the test. You walk in with that. And by this time I had taken a short course, refresher course in engineering that was put on by a university in New Mexico. For all of thermo in 45 minutes.
All of the next subject in 45. Yeah.
All of calculus in 15 minutes. One of those kind of things, which was sort of fun. Anyway, I only got the professional I said, wait a minute. I called the state up. I'm supposed to get 2 because I know you have to have 2. She says, oh, I don't know. I'll go look in your file. You've been excused. Okay. So I took the test, passed it, of course. Later, I ran into a guy that was on the committee.
Oh, okay.
And he said, oh, shit, we knew you couldn't possibly have passed the EIT. And besides, with 28 years of engineering experience, we'd have had a grandfather you in at 30 anyway. So that's another good story.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Anyway, so leading up to actually getting out, though I had no plans at that point to get fired or anything, I just sort of kind of keep a little finger in the outside world. I worked for a guy just around the corner, actually, who was doing extremely sharp 300 picosecond sharp radar pulses out, and you could see, it turns out if you process them right, you can see right through the wall, and you're all out of resolution. So I built him boards that their average power was 10 watts, but their peak power was a kilowatt. What they did is they dumped avalanche diodes, and the trick was to lay out the printed circuit line so it had the right logarithmic capacitance stage up through 10 stages or something, and you charged down 3,000 volts and up 3,000 volts, and then you said go, and it all worked. And then he had another project which was measuring the corrosion and stuff in pipelines up in Alaska before they all fail. And then, but the one that I'll just end with is, he said, I've got a contract from Eglin Air Force Base to build a fuse, echo of the past for me, yes, which will survive on the front of the blockbuster bomb. We want it to go down through the earth, and when it gets to the bunker, we don't want it to explode. And it turns out that there's so much noise in mechanical fuses that measure the deacceleration, because what you do is you watch it deaccelerate. When it gets right in the spot, it doesn't deaccelerate for a moment, and then that's when you fire it. That's how you know there's a little empty space in there. Well, but the noise and the vibrations and everything, everything vibrates, and there's chunks of rock in the ground, and there's rebar in the
there's all sorts
terrible.
of, yes.
They just couldn't make it work. So he said he went into he looked up in the ARRL handbook for a Colpitts oscillator, which could be built with one transistor and a coil or two, and it would change frequency when it got into the low dielectric space. And when it was in a high dielectric space, it was one frequency. And so as soon as the worked like a champ. What was I supposed to do? Well, I was supposed to reduce this to a dime-sized printed circuit board with 4 parts on it or whatever. And they put it in the front of a 155 millimeter howitzer shell. Oh. And the way they packaged it was to put it in micro beads and then get a gorilla on the other end and squeeze the back of the shell and make it all just really tight. And it worked. And he says, now you can't tell anybody. It's black,
Yeah.
About 6 months later, it was published in the front page of the local newspaper about how they had a fuse now that depended on frequency instead of mechanical.
Mechanical pressure, yeah.
Well, we shot it through 4 feet of concrete, followed by 10 feet of dirt, followed by another few feet of concrete, and it broadcast the whole way.
Wow.
And what all you saw, of course, was the frequency that went, and that's it. But that's enough.
That's all you need.
Okay.
You can
well,
make a detector on that really easily.
Shooting ping pong balls down evacuated.
Oh,
tubes.
we missed that one. We should, if you want, we can back up, but for just a second.
Okay.
So the other outside job. Oh no, that came later. So forget it. So the ping pong ball.
Yes, we're going to circle
Ted
back.
Johnson. We're back now to 1983. Okay. Ted Johnson calls me up. And he says, I got a fella here that works at MIT, and he wants to know the craziest mechanical engineer in the United States. Well, with that kind of a introduction, how can you not stop listening?
At least.
Well, it turned out a fellow named Frank Davidson, who had married Schlumberger money, so he was rich, was a tunneling freak. His dad had built the Croton Reservoir Tunnel up north of New York that goes down 1,000 feet down or something like that.
Yes, right.
And so he was a tunneling freak, and he was going to have, he said to me, a conference the following year at MIT, and he thought that the conference would demonstrate that we were close to being able to drill a hole from New York to Los Angeles at a cheap enough price that you could shove trains through it at a great rate of speed, and when you can make it perfectly straight and there's no weather problems, you can start thinking about really high performance trains. Now in 68 or so like that, Scientific American had an article on this. And they wanted to go fast, but their idea of fast was 200 or 300 miles an hour, which is pretty good.
That's pretty fast.
Yeah, but my guy wants it supersonic, and neither he or I knew at the time you cannot go faster than the speed of sound through an orifice. Well, then the question is, how does a rocket work? Well, the answer is the speed of sound right in the orifice, where it's super hot and super high pressure, is very high. So it does get through, and then it expands. Speed of sound goes down, but you're now above supersonic. So that's why these bell-shaped, and we didn't know all that. Anyway, he says, all I want you to do is demonstrate in the MIT backyard at our conference, something moving at supersonic speeds through a tube. And now there's a whole lot of stuff to talk about, but never mind. I went out in the backyard a few weeks later, and I evacuated a 2-inch diameter, 150 foot long, and to accelerate, and then I put I tried lots of things, but ice cubes, slippery, balsa wood, light, ping pong balls, lighter still.
Yeah.
And
Now, this is all in Albuquerque.
all in Albuquerque,
Yeah,
in my
okay.
backyard.
Yeah.
And we basically pumped vacuum on this side, and then had a diaphragm on this side, and we punched the diaphragm. Now, one of the minor tricks is that diaphragm better be made of brittle, not ductile. Because if it's ductile, it doesn't form a shock wave. It's too slow to form the shock wave.
Really?
So the first thing we did it, and the far end just had a flap so that the projectile could escape. And we shot it, and it didn't. No, where is it? We looked all down the desert, couldn't find it. It was right in the middle of the tube. How did it get there when you had this? Well, turns out that the pressure wave would go past the ball. At the far end of the tube, it would refract and bounce back and stop the ball from moving down the tube. Oh, interesting way to learn physics, you know.
The experimental method.
Yeah. Anyway, to kind of compress it all, it was soon pretty clear, and we learned that you can't go faster, you can't go supersonic. So we built a helium gas gun. Now, the speed of sound in helium is 4 times the speed of sound in air. So what you do is you stick the nose of the gun 1.5 inches or something in diameter, and you bust the diaphragm at the end of it, and have the poor unsuspecting ping pong ball hit by a shock wave, And the next thing you know, snowflakes of ping pong ball all the way down the tube. Why? Well, the shock wave compresses the back of the ball before the frontal ball knows about it. And of course, that sort of destroys the ball. So that problem existed up to about 6 weeks before we actually went to MIT.
Oh my God.
And it was solved by a friend of mine, a spectator. He says, well, what you do is you put a little polyurethane foam in it. Well, sure enough, the speed of sound in the solid, well, it's foam, but it's still a solid, is fast enough so that it gets to the front of the ball and starts accelerating it before the back of the ball gets far enough to break. And lo and behold, it worked.
Oh, wow.
So,
did you go supersonic?
Yeah. Well, supersonic
In helium.
In helium, right.
Now, down the length of the tube, of course, it slowed down more or less right away. But, so go to MIT, lay out, go over to the mechanical engineering lab or wherever, get a tube of helium, buy 1,000 feet of 1.5 inch, 2 inch irrigation tubing.
Yeah.
Cement it all together along that fence that's along the back wall. If you come out the front door of MIT, you hit a building, and then behind it is the athletic field or field. Okay. Over the wall on the right side, chain link fence that's along the street, right along that for 1,000 feet. Pump the vacuum, try it. Doesn't work. Turns out there's a bunch of stones in the pipe. Blah, 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 It's the only experiment I've ever made that all the lead-ins failed and the actual demo worked. Mostly it's the other way around.
Oh my God.
The practice, you get it so it works and then it doesn't work. And we had a light beam and a little stupid 8051 base Altair, I don't know, some little computer board, and time the time between the two lights to prove that it really was supersonic, or at least, and it was, I don't know, 700 meters a second or something. And so we shoot it, and part of my game was to take the helium gas gun out of the long tube and put the ping pong ball in its snout. I guess the diaphragm was back there. And of course it only goes, even though it may have been supersonic for a few
nanoseconds.
Yeah, right over. But at the far end, we had a bunch of old socks, which from a vacuum point of view, aficionados, they outgas like crazy. But you don't need that. 1 torr is good enough, which is still, it's only 1,000th of an atmosphere. That's high
plenty
pressure.
For this test.
It's plenty for this test, but it's a high pressure for the real vacuum types. Anyway, so we're sitting there, and there's all these big wigs, and there was people from China and Japan and all over the place. It was a serious conference. And I'm there in my orange zoot suit. And pretty soon, and I'm telling them the truth, we haven't seen this work yet. This kid comes up on a bicycle. He had been traveling across the field, and he heard a thunk at that end. He says, there's a ping pong ball at the end of your tube. So, I mean, how well could it turn out? Couldn't turn out any better. So,
oh my God.
Frank Davidson makes me up this fancy, pronouncement, and it's all in high-class script. Then he said, here comes the epilogue. He says, now let's do this right. Let's do it electromagnetically. Why are we doing it with? Because of course everyone understood, and I made sure people knew that this was, you aren't hardly going to accelerate people at 25 Gs. So anyway, it was just, not even quite a demonstration of principle. It's almost principle.
Yes, yes. a piece, no, a piece of the principle.
Yeah,
a piece of the physics.
Well, one of the practical problems, aside from the fact that it's more expensive than you think to make a straight tunnel, and what about the underground, is that it's hard to make a leak-proof large tunnel. So there would, I think, there'd be just no way you'd have to get it below 1 torr for, if you're talking serious distances. I worked out the calculations. If you start with something you can take, like a 1/4 G in Boston, head for New York, and accelerate at a 1/4 G, when you're halfway, you're 6 minutes, and you're going 1 kilometer a second. Now, if you then gently deaccelerate at 1/2 G, you just slide into Grand Central Station, and the whole trip is 13 minutes. Now, here comes the twist to that. If you don't deaccelerate, you just coast. See, in principle, with vacuum, you don't.
Yeah, right.
In practice, of course,
you could
it does.
coast.
But in 40 minutes, you're in Dallas. So the idea is not completely way out in left field. It's just a matter of getting a few details right. So anyway, so he says,
must may have something that
Yeah.
even he could not build.
yeah, that's right. So the guy, Davidson says, we got to do this again, only you're going to do it electric. So I got in the backyard again and found us a 3 kilovolt capacitor, 40 microfarads, I think it was. And I got my same friend this is the high-speed radar stuff, who knows about. He says it's all in the inductance. So, and we made a little pancake coil, size of a 1/4, and dumped the charge from the 3,000 volts, 40, whatever that is for joules. And,
A bunch.
A bunch, yes. And accelerated a washer, aluminum washer, so fast. All the force turns out to be around the rim, just the way the fields work out.
Yeah.
It made the washer slightly conical,
Yeah.
slightly cup-shaped, because it was, we calculated it was 25,000 Gs. It got up to supersonic in 4 or 5 centimeters. No, less than that, because it gets out of the field right away. So, I mean, and we had the washer, because we wanted to insulate it from the pancake coil, which turned out to be ridiculous, because there's no place for the current to go. I mean, it's too. But anyway, it moved away from the paint on the washer. So we figured a great way to take the paint off the side of your house, just move the whole house sideways at 25,000 Gs. No problem.
The paint will just stay there.
It did.
And the house will move.
The paint was still sitting in the Vaseline, which we'd stuck it to, you know. Anyway, so we played around with it, got it working, and came back to MIT a year later, and the forklift guy in the shop punched a hole right in our setup, so it ended up not working. It's more like the reality of the way these things go. And we had a little railroad train, and the problem here is the real train would be operating in a vacuum. Guess what? You need the air to prevent the arc from going from the overhead tramway to anywhere in the world. And when you get 25,000 volts on a wire, the field strength's very high, right at the diameter of the wire. Right. So it goes ahead and breaks the air down, and if there's no air to break down, it just keeps on going. So there's another one of these funny little things. Anyway, didn't work. He says, well, we're going to do it in Paris. I'll pay your way. He did. We did. So I'm in Paris at someplace, I don't know, some university, turn up the power, bingo. And it didn't impress anybody exactly. I mean, okay, so you shot a washer across the room and hit the wall, you know. But my friend was happy and he paid for my trip, so what the hell.
Okay.
And that's that story.
All right.
Now, I guess we can switch to just what happened next after DEC.
Sure.
Yes, keep going.
Okay.
That's how we got into this story.
Yeah,
Oh
okay.
no, we
we
went back.
backed
Yes,
up.
got it. Yeah, let's keep going.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so I was getting into little bits of
Little
stuff,
jobs.
which were nothing at the time, But now I'm free, or at least, and I get one of these, buyer's remorse type things. Here I am. I got no more. All my network is in the company. They're gone. I'm never going to see them again. Oh, poor me. And I went down to a friend of mine at Zomeworks and said, well, can I do something for you? And he said yes and stuff. And so pretty soon I ended up with another company. I forget how the connection was made, called the Quattro Corporation. And they're making for Los Alamos Labs ultrasonic, what they call it, non-destructive testing stuff. Find the hair. See, you can't find a hairline crack with X-rays because there's no difference in difference for it to see anything. So you can't find it. But if you, and the best quick example, we took a ping pong ball, ball bearing, supported on 3 points, one of which is ultrasonic vibrator, and another of which is an ultrasonic sensor, and then the third is dummy. And now you sweep the frequency, and it's all in the 20, 30, 40 kilohertz range for this size stuff. And think about it. What happens is, as you get to just the right frequency, all of a sudden the ball goes like crazy, and it's a single mode vibration. It's only one dimension of a sphere, no matter how you slice it. So you sweep it, and you take a look, and you get a spike. Now, if you just take a piece of sandpaper and just hit it, just a little tiny dot, all of a sudden that peak is surrounded by a lot of little ones, because the sound is bouncing around inside the ping pong ball at slightly different phases and frequencies, okay? So that's the principle. Well, the company had me build a board or two to ship to Los Alamos to implement the drivers and stuff like that. And then that got me to Los Alamos, and they don't pay either. And to a fellow named Al Migliori, and we established a really nice relation for a year. And I basically built him the proof of concept one, the breadboard one, the prototype one, and then finally he got other people to build. Meanwhile, at the company that I was working for, that hooked me onto all this, they needed a production manager temporarily, and they needed a parts guy, and so I was sort of their whole manufacturing and purchasing, the whole thing. So that was fun, but still not exactly where Joan would like me to be, which is mowing the lawn properly in front of the house. Well, I'm exaggerating. I guess that's all we need to say for now. I got into some stuff like that, and my friend with the high-speed radar, and then pretty soon we moved to Albuquerque by the accident of having a friend who lived across the street in Albuquerque, but who had a condo here. And it was what they call 1035. If you buy it with money that you got from rental, if the new one is also rental, it works. Yes. If not, you have to pay capital gains taxes. Right. So he couldn't move into his own condo, so he says, go stay there for a month and invite us down. And we had to do it right. You had to actually pay real money but he gave it back to me under the table, and we just split the real estate dealer's cut.
Yes, okay.
And so anyway, we found this house That's another story, but never mind. And by the time the month was over, we bought it. And and finally, let's end up with this one spot. The real estate dealer that sold us the house said, there's a lady you really ought to talk to named Liz Van Thrasher, who is building a small commercial center with 5 commercial, it's a store and a cafe and stuff. Yeah. And the upper part of 2 of them is residential, so a total of 7 things. And she wants it to be 100% solar powered, no outside power. So again, long story short, we end up with 400 solar panels on the roof, and for 2 years until we put in a bakery, which sucked up a lot of power, and the general store guy put in a walk-in freezer, which somehow sucked up. Anyway, for a couple of years we did 104% of our energy was totally, and this includes a subtraction for the little propane we did use for one of the things, because that wasn't made on site, so you can't count that.
Okay.
And we caught the eye of, well, again, it's a little intricate, but we ended up with a University of Miami civil engineering department who needed a test site. Now, by this time we were measuring, we still are, measuring 250 electric circuits, not every last one, but all the ones that counted. Yeah. So we had minute-by-minute data for years of just how the electricity went.
And where it went, exactly, as opposed to the central meter.
That's right.
Yeah, you had
all the details.
Information.
Yeah. And so they lapped that up because the civil engineering departments want to be able to tell the architects what their building is going to cost and how much air conditioning it's going to need, and what if they change the windows to here and all that stuff. Instead of waiting till it's all built and say, oh yeah, well, I guess we were right or wrong, they'd like to have a simulation package, but they need to validate it. So it was perfect. Well, sure enough, they had a bureaucratical thing, and they've all moved to University of Colorado Boulder. But they're still all involved. In fact, just the day before yesterday, we reinstalled a $10,000 sun tracker. Fascinating device in itself. One piece of it is run by software and aims exactly where the sun is, whether or not there's clouds. The other piece of it looks at the whole sky, minus they've got a shading device so that the direct sun doesn't hit the second one. Equally, the diffuse sun doesn't hit the first one. So they can split it apart. Now, in a hazy climate like this one is, you get a lot more from a flat plate collector than you would have thought. Equally, when it isn't hazy, you better concentrate it and look just at the sun, or if you look at the whole sky, you're not getting anything because there isn't any haze out there to reflect in, or clouds. Yeah. So we're hazy compared to Albuquerque. This place, they call themselves the Sunshine State, but it's only got about 85%, plus which it's got clouds going by all the time and stuff. Yeah. Unlike Albuquerque. So I have to laugh. But anyway, so then she wants to, just to make the end of it, drill 2 wells down to the aquifer, pump the water up, warm it up a few degrees, and put it back because they won't let you take it out, and use that water to be the sink for the heat for all 10 of our air conditioners, which are now water-cooled air conditioners. And the whole thing is like 35 or 40% cheaper. But nobody could afford to drill those wells unless you had 10 or, commercial development. Well, actually, there are some wells in which they put just one well and a hairpin loop down and up. And it's all right. But engineer story. The book says that the ground temperature is 72 degrees. year-round. Well, it goes up a degree or two, and it is. And I've done it. You dig down a few feet so you're not just the very first layer. And it doesn't matter. It's 72 all the time. Okay. So the engineer types design it because that says that in the book. Not only that, I know it's true. I've measured it.
Yeah.
Oh, well, there's a problem. There is a limestone layer around here that's about 100 feet down. So you can't make the well go any deeper than that limestone layer, and there's not enough surface area in that well to cool 40 gallons a minute, or to move 40 gallons a minute so that the delta T isn't too big. Engineer says, no problem. We'll just dig through the limestone layer to the so-called Florida aquifer, take it out of there, and we'll go down 450 feet, which they did, and then another 450 feet over there for the sink well. Guess what? The water down there is a lot hotter.
Really?
Yeah! Who would know? Answer, every single well driller in the world knows that. But the engineer reads the book. So that's a good engineering story. So they had to double the size of the heat exchanger. But I think that's another good story.
Wow.
Anyway, so I kind of keep track of them. And as I say, the day before yesterday, we put the sun tracker failed. It's made in Delft. Shipped it back to Delft. They did a few firmware tweaks, and that's why it was always a degree or so off in elevation. Gee whiz. And the reset button works now. Stuff. It was turns out it was the first one ever made. Now they got it was serial number 160006. And 0005 was the last prototype.
Exactly.
And this was the first cellular. Now they've got about 20 out there, which, however, it's a very good instrument, but it turns out not to be enough sales, so they dropped it. But they still have to maintain it, especially if they want to make a reputation of integrity, for future sales. Like, what's new?
Wow.
And so anyway, and every once in a while, of course, the lady who runs this got all her money, 50 million pounds, by starting up a company that makes baby food in England that's all organic. Back when she started it, it was all just applesauce with different flavors, really. And she beat up the real thing, strawberries, peaches. Simple enough idea, but of course more expensive than just doctored up. But anyway, in the view of the last 30 years of this organic stuff, she made herself a pile. She sold it. She put $5 million into this development. The ROI is terrible. It's maybe 5 or 6%. And so she's also a starter-upper and not a runner. Although her goal is to educate she says, I want everybody to have solar on their roof, and I want to demonstrate that it works. And that's all very noble. Anyway, and then she gets cancer. So pretty soon she really, you understand. Anyway, just Monday, today's Wednesday, Monday, I'm there, as it happens for this solar thing. She shows up. She says, Tom, I took this off the market. I was going to sell it. But you see, that nobody who wants it as a real estate, they want 8% or 10, they can't live with 4 or 5. And however nifty it may be. So we're all really pleased that she's back with, she says, this is my baby, we're going to make it work. And of course it had been, I work on it less and less, but we did put in 2 new Wi-Fi hotspots along with a Ubiquiti, what do they call it? Anyway, it makes it so when you walk around, it goes from one hotspot to the other automatically, and the person doesn't know it. There's a name. There's a name for that. Yep. And the guy who's helping me with this, His name is Neil. And he turns out to be the guy who manages the entire network for Manatee County. The jail, 911, stoplights, all the bureaus, all of the town halls, everything. So he has more stories than he can tell you. I mean, it's really great. One is they have this emergency meeting up at the prison. They can't get the doors open because the doors are on the internet.
Oh, the Internet of Things?
Yeah.
Doors in the prison.
And
That's pretty interesting.
I'm sure it must not be quite literally true. You have to be able to have a key, but that's how he puts it. And so he goes to this big meeting, and he says, did anybody reset the machine? Oh. Turns out somebody had done the equivalent of stumbling over the cord, and unplugged it or something, and it didn't reboot. So, but that's the simple story. But he's got a lot of complicated stories that is really something. Anyway, the point is, I got really good backup for Internet of Things and DCP/IP and elemental.
Really good network support.
Yeah, really good network support. And he's in the same position I was in some years ago. He's trying to get ready for retirement and wants to keep his finger into something that will amuse him after he gets out. He's got a lot better pension system than I had. But so he doesn't have to worry so much about the money, but it's the activity, So he loves to fire around. I'm going to go have dinner with him tomorrow night, and he's going to tell me. I've got the same installation in my house, which I got a water-cooled air conditioner. It runs into the sea with a loop, and blah, blah, blah. We measure the temperatures in and out and the flow rate and fire around. And it's not working quite right at the moment, so Neil will help.
Oh, very good.
And my son-in-law, he lives in England. He runs a massive bunch of programmers. Have you ever heard of a thing called wait a minute. It's not iShares, it's not iPrograms, iPlayer. We started up 10 years ago in England to do TV off the internet. And the idea was that you could get any BBC program in the preceding 168 hours. It's a whole lot harder than you think because they put different commercials in different areas. So you now have to get those commercials back in because, of course, they're all just stored once somewhere. And, there's a lot of little stuff. Anyway, his group, he was working for BBC at the time, did iPlayer, which makes them famous. They ordered 40 servers from Holland. No, they ordered 100 servers from Holland, but by the deadline, they only had 40. So it sucked down the whole internet in the south end of England until they got around to, cleaning it up and adding servers and stuff like that. Well, anyway, the point is that with backup like that, I can't fail.
Very good. Very good. All right. Well, we also, tend to like to ask, sort of more general questions of
sure.
Of our interviewees. One of them we always like to ask is do you have any words of wisdom or advice to young people who were like you, say, when you were in high school or early in college, before you'd figured out really what you wanted to do?
See, that's a hard one for me because I just stumbled into everything. So, on the other hand, there must be something. What would I say? Well, of course, there's the standard one. Stick to what you love. If it's teaching and it's low pay, but you like teaching, because it's going to take you, I guess the most basic, it's going to take you 10,000 hours or 20,000 to get good at whatever you want to do. And if you don't love it, you're not going to spend the 20,000, and most people don't. so they don't get, 20% of the people do 80% of the work, that kind of but you don't get in the 20%. And that goes for sports too.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, thank you. But that's just pablum. I mean, everybody knows that. What would I say to somebody who was sitting there? Well, I have said lots of times a variation on that theme.
Okay.
Don't go into a job as a brand newbie saying I can do anything, because then that person has to decide. The idea is you go into the HR type or something and you say, a half step is say I can wash floors, I'm great at doing dishes, and oh, by the way, I can solder. That's a partial step, because then you got something to pick. Even better, though, is if you can do a little bit of looking and find out what the person wants, and say, I'm good at soldering. Because if you say something which you believe to be true, which probably is, I can do all kinds of things, it doesn't help. So that would be one. Okay. And I've given people that actual bit of advice. Don't make the hiring person have to make a decision any more than the obvious one, whether they want to hire you.
Okay.
Let's see, that's one. Follow your bliss, that's common these days. Well, there's one that I guess only applies after you've been around forever. Finally, if you know it's right, just do it, because but you can only do that when you're not too worried about getting fired. Now, as soon as you don't worry about getting fired, then you never do, because you do things right. Now, there's some version of that must be applicable when you're starting, and I don't know how to phrase it.
All right, but that's still a good one. Okay.
Yeah. I learned that one purely by accident when I was about 35.
Okay.
I always thought that I was a terrible manager, and I am, except I can cope with a dozen or two folks and get it right. But as far as big deal projects, and I was surprised to find that I'm more social than I thought I was going in. But I don't see how that's relevant to advice for somebody. I suppose the true form of that is find out what you're good at and act on it, but that's much easier said than done.
Okay, good.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Ask another question.
those are good ones. Good. Now, do you know anything about the museum?
Nothing. I think I was there once for a half an hour, and I've also learned lately that you're going to get kicked out by Google next door and you're looking for a new place. Now, I think that's the end of what I know.
Okay, but were you there when it was in Boston or in San Francisco?
San Francisco.
Okay, good.
Yeah, well, of course, everybody knew Gwen, and Gwen would pipe up about it a lot. So I knew of it in Boston, but no, I didn't.
Okay. Good. Well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Do this.
You can tell. I love to tell stories.
Yeah.
I got another day's worth if you want.
Are there any areas that we sort of missed, Grant?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think that the general question at the end, we just paraphrase that question into maybe later in your life running technology programs. What would be your advice to managers trying to, or senior people trying to make new things happen? Any ideas? Any rules of thumb? That
hire people that are good at making things happen. Well, by the time you're a senior manager, you're out of the loop.
Yeah. No, you're really trying to make a new development project work. I mean, you're at that level, not the.
I would just go back to what I said lots earlier, is what my company commander said. My job is to work for you to do what you could do yourself, but I can do it better because I got more rank. And I would sort of stick to that. Find out what your people need and do it for them would be, I guess, short form. Now, you don't always, it's not so obvious. When I first got into some management, 2 or 3 people, I learned that if a guy comes in your office and starts crying, there's probably a reason, but it may not be the reason you think. And that actually happened. Another one is, I was surprised to find that one of my employees, all he needed was every 3 months to talk it over with somebody, because he'd made a list of everything that he should be doing, and of course it overwhelmed him. And I would just say, well, there's only 2 things you can do, whatever you're doing, and then when it has a little pause because you're waiting for parts, well, you can do number 2, and sometimes they both pause for one. You can do number 3. That's all you can do. And he would walk out. It happened, it was kind of odd. It happened every 3 months. We chopped off the other 10 items on his list, and he went away happy till he stacked himself up again. And along those same lines, I guess, managing people at one level is stupidly simple, because people have only got 3 or 4 glands in here. There's a territorial gland, and there's a evil gland, and then there's a love-needed gland, or however you want to phrase it. So if you can just, when there's a problem or something, if you can just figure out which gland is causing it, the symptom might be the same for each one of those glands' problems. So you kind of got to look and see. On the other hand, the big thing I learned early, 35 years old or something, it's not as complex as the books say. And on the other hand, neither is as simple as just walking around. But it's not that. People have been the same for the last 10,000 years, and they will be the same. So you don't really have to think, oh God, I got to learn all this complexity. And I guess it took me a long time to learn that. I'm sure you've run into that same thing.
Okay.
Good.
All right.
All right.
Well, with that postscript, thank
Okay.
you very much.
You're welcome.
Tom.